In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind every teacup, Miss Jane Marple overhears a chilling whisper, a shadow council, plotting in the shadows. Who are these strangers conspiring in her quiet hamlet? What is the sinister syndicate they serve, and why does it threaten the heart of her community? As cryptic notes, coded lists, and midnight meetings unravel a web of deceit, Miss Marple's sharp mind and fearless spirit lead her from village tea shops to dangerous confrontations, exposing a criminal empire that reaches far beyond her quaint home. Will this unassuming spinster outwit a ruthless syndicate before it's too late, or will St. Mary Mead fall to their sinister grip? Dive into a tale of suspense, cunning, and small-town secrets that will keep you guessing until the final page. Chapter 1. The Whisper in St. Mary Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft glow of an autumn afternoon. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the distant chime of the church bell marked the hour with a comforting predictability. To the untrained eye, this was a place of serene routine, where the most pressing concern might be the quality of Mrs. Price's scones at the weekly bake sale. But to Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster who had spent her life observing the subtle currents beneath the village's placid surface, St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of secrets, woven with threads of human nature that were rarely as innocent as they seemed. Miss Marple sat at her usual corner table in Mrs. Hubbard's tea shop, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The shop was a cozy haven, its walls lined with mismatched china and faded floral wallpaper. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the handful of patrons who sipped tea and exchanged gossip. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and bright despite her advancing years, flitted from her knitting to the room, taking in every detail: the way Mrs. Hubbard fussed over a chipped teapot, the nervous tapping of young Clara's foot as she served a tray of biscuits, and a low murmur of conversation from the table by the window, where two strangers sat huddled over their cups. The strangers were an odd pair. One was a wiry man in a tweed coat, his face half hidden by a scarf despite the mild weather. The other, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a sleek black hat, spoke in a clipped tone that carried just far enough to pique Miss Marple's interest. They had arrived in the village that morning, claiming to be tourists passing through, but their guarded demeanor suggested otherwise. Miss Marple had a knack for spotting those who didn't belong, and these two were as out of place as a fox in a henhouse. The shadow council won't wait, the woman said, her voice low but urgent. If we don't secure the route by next week, the whole operation could collapse. The man leaned closer, his scarf slipping slightly to reveal a thin scar across his jaw. Keep your voice down, Elise. The last thing we need is some nosy villager catching wind of this. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment, then resumed their steady rhythm. A shadow council. The phrase was intriguing, laced with a hint of menace that seemed absurdly out of place in St. Mary Mead. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to adjust her glasses, and strained to catch more of their conversation. It's not just the route, Elise continued, her fingers tightening around her teacup. Grayson's getting impatient. He says the syndicate's ready to cut us out if we don't deliver. The man snorted softly. Grayson's always impatient, but he knows We're the only ones who can handle the village end. Without us, his precious syndicate is just a bunch of city suits with no foothold. Miss Marple's mind whirred. A syndicate? That was a word she associated with crime novels, not her quiet village. Yet the intensity of their exchange, the way their eyes darted toward the door, suggested something far more serious than idle chatter. She glanced at Mrs. Hubbard, who was now polishing the counter with a vigor that betrayed her own curiosity. Clara, the young waitress, hovered near the stranger's table, her tray wobbling slightly as she lingered longer than necessary. "Clara, dear," Miss Marple called softly, her voice warm but firm. "Could you fetch me another pot of Earl? Gray, this one's gone cold." Clara blinked, startled, and hurried to the counter, her cheeks flushing. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The girl was sweet but prone to eavesdropping, a habit Miss Marple understood all too well. As Clara bustled away, the strangers lowered their voices further, their words now a faint hum. Miss Marple sighed inwardly. She would have to find another. Wait to learn more. The tea-shop door jingled, and Mr. Clement, the vicar, stepped inside, his round face beaming as he greeted the room. "Good afternoon, everyone. Mrs. Hubbard, I trust you've saved me a slice of that lemon drizzle cake?" Mrs. Hubbard laughed, her earlier tension easing. "For you, vicar. Always. Though you'll have to fight Mrs. Price for the last piece." The strangers glanced up, their expressions tightening for a moment before they resumed their hushed discussion. Miss Marple noted their reaction, filing it away like a piece of her knitting pattern. The vicar settled at a table near hers, pulling out a small notebook and scribbling something with a fountain pen. He was a kind man, but his sermons often revealed more about village affairs than he intended, and Miss Marple made a mental note to chat with him later. As the afternoon wore on, the strangers paid their bill and left, their departure marked by the jangle of coins and a curt nod to Mrs. Hubbard. Miss Marple watched them through the window as they disappeared down the lane, their heads bent close together. She finished her tea, tucked her knitting into her bag, and rose with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew haste drew attention. "Thank you, Mrs. Hubbard," she said, placing a few coins on the table. "Your scones were delightful." "As always," Mrs. Hubbard beamed. "You're too kind, Miss Marple. Will we see you at the library fundraiser tomorrow?" "Oh, I wouldn't miss it," Miss Marple replied, her smile hiding the gears turning in her mind. The library was a hub of village activity, and if these strangers were involved in something as ominous as a shadow council, they might leave traces there. The next morning, St. Mary Mead buzzed with the quiet excitement of the library fundraiser. The village hall, a stone's throw from the church, was decked with bunting and tables laden with books, baked goods, and jars of homemade jam. Miss Marple arrived early, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the cobblestones. She wore a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. To all appearances she was just another villager, eager to support a good cause, but her eyes scanned the crowd with the precision of a hawk. The library itself was a quaint building, its shelves groaning under the weight of well-loved books. Miss Marple volunteered to sort donations, a task that allowed her to linger among the stacks and observe the comings and goings. She noticed the postmaster, Mr. Polk, sorting through a pile of letters with unusual intensity, his fingers pausing over an envelope with a wax seal. It was an odd detail wax seals were rare in St. Mary Mead, where most correspondence was as plain as the village itself. "Mr. Pock," Miss Marple said, approaching with a stack of novels, "you seem quite absorbed in your work today." Mr. Pock flushed. "Yes, well, some folks like to be fancy. Excuse me, I've got to get these sorted." He hurried off, clutching the envelope tightly. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. Mr. Pock was a reliable sort, but his nervousness was out of character. She made her way to the donation table, where Mrs. Price was arguing good-naturedly with the vicar over the price of a dog-eared Agatha Christie novel. "It's a classic, Vicar," Mrs. Price insisted, her hands on her hips. "You can't expect me to let it go for a shilling." Miss Marple smiled and slipped into the library's back room, where donated books awaited sorting. The room was quiet, save for the rustle of pages and the occasional creak of the floorboards. She began sorting, her fingers brushing over faded covers, but her mind was elsewhere. The stranger's conversation replayed in her head, each word. A thread in a pattern she couldn't yet see. A shadow council. A syndicate. Grayson. The words were like pebbles dropped into a still pond, their ripples spreading outward dot as she reached for a battered copy of The Hound of the Baskervilles. Something slipped from its pages, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but marked with fresh ink. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She glanced around to ensure she was alone, then unfolded the note. It was written in a hurried scrawl, the letters uneven but legible, meeting at the old oak. Midnight, 3rd. Bring the list. No mistakes, or Grayson will have our heads dot below the words was a crude sketch of an oak tree, unmistakably the ancient one at the edge of the village, near the old mill. Miss Marple's lips pursed. This was no coincidence. The book had been donated that morning, likely slipped into the pile by someone unaware of its significance. Or perhaps they had meant for it to be found, but by whom? She tucked the note into her pocket, her mind racing. The fundraiser bustled on outside, the laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the secret she now held. She returned to the donation table, her face a mask of calm, and spent the rest of the morning sorting books and chatting with villagers. But her thoughts were fixed on midnight, on the old oak, and on the shadowy figures who might gather there. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her cottage window, the curtains drawn just enough to let in the moonlight. Her knitting lay untouched, her needles silent for once. She had told no one of the note, not even her nephew, Raymond, who was visiting from London and prone to dismissing her village fancies, as he called them. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen too much of human nature to ignore the signs, the stranger's urgency, Mr. Pock's unease, and now this note. A key to a door she hadn't yet opened dot as the village clock struck 11. She donned a dark shawl and slipped out into the night. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the sky. St. Mary Mead slept, its cottages dark and quiet, but Miss Marple moved with purpose, her steps light on the familiar paths. The old oak stood at the edge of the village, its gnarled branches casting eerie shadows. She found a vantage point behind a low stone wall, hidden by a tangle of ivy, and settled in to wait. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Then, just as the clock chimed midnight, she saw them 2 figures approaching the oak, their silhouettes indistinct but their movements cautious. One was tall, the other shorter, and their voices carried faintly on the breeze. Double quotes. The list is secure, the shorter figure said, a woman's voice, Elise, perhaps. But Grayson's pushing for more control. He's talking about expanding the operation. The taller figure grunted. He's a fool if he thinks we can keep this quiet much longer. The village is too small. Someone's bound to notice. Miss Marple's breath caught. They were talking about St. Mary Mead, her village, her home. She strained to hear more, but a sudden rustle in the bushes nearby made her freeze. A third figure emerged, a hulking shape that moved with the stealth of a predator. The strangers tensed, their conversation halting, as the newcomer scanned the area. Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. Had she been seen? The third figure spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You're late. Grayson doesn't like waiting." "We're here, aren't we?" Elise snapped. "Tell him the village is under control. The postmaster's on board and the routes secure." The man muttered something Miss Marple couldn't catch, then handed over a small package. The strangers took it, and the group dispersed, melting into the shadows. Miss Marple waited, her muscles cramped, but her resolve unshaken. When she was certain they were gone, she crept closer to the oak, her eyes scanning the ground for any clue they might have left behind. There, caught in a root, was a scrap of paper, torn and smudged, but still legible. She plucked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, and slipped it into her pocket. Back in the safety of her cottage, she unfolded it under the glow of her lamp. It was a list of names none she recognized immediately, but their initials matched. Those of prominent villagers, the mayor, the postmaster, even the vicar's wife. Beside each name was a sum of money, written in the same hurried scrawl as the note in the book. Miss Marple sat back, her mind alight with possibilities. The Shadow Council, the Syndicate, the names, it was all connected, a web of deceit spun, right under the noses of St. Mary Mead's residents. She knew she should be frightened, but instead she felt a spark of excitement, the kind that came from unraveling a puzzle no one else had noticed. This was no ordinary village gossip. This was something dangerous, something that threatened the very heart of her community. She folded the list carefully and tucked it into her knitting bag, hidden beneath the soft folds of her shawl. Tomorrow she would begin to pull at the threads, to see where they led. For now she allowed herself a small smile. The strangers thought they could operate in secret, but they hadn't counted on Miss Jane Marple, whose quiet demeanor hid a mind as sharp as her knitting needles. As she blew out the lamp and settled into bed, the village clock chimed 1. Its sound a gentle reminder that St. Mary Mead was still hers to protect, and protect it she would, one carefully placed stitch at a time. Chapter 2. The Midnight Gathering. The night was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth, as Miss Jane Marple slipped through the shadows of St. Mary Mead. The village, usually a tapestry of cozy lamplight and soft murmurs, was now cloaked in an uneasy stillness broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the late autumn breeze. Her heart, though steady, thrummed with the thrill of the unknown. The cryptic note she'd found tucked inside a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice at the village library had been specific. A meeting tonight at the old oak grove on the edge of town, where the hedgerows met the crumbling stone wall. The words shadow council and midnight had burned into her memory, igniting a curiosity she couldn't quell. Miss Marple adjusted her woman's shawl, its muted gray blending seamlessly with the darkness. She was no stranger to the art of going unnoticed. Years of observing village life gossip at the tea shop, furtive glances at church, the subtle tensions in a neighbor's tone had honed her ability to fade into the background. Tonight she wore her plainest coat, a pair of sturdy boots, and a knitted cap pulled low over her silver hair. Her walking stick, a practical accessory for a woman of her age, doubled as a tool to steady her steps on the uneven path. She moved, with purpose, her eyes sharp, scanning the familiar lanes now transformed by moonlight into something altogether more mysterious. The oak grove was a good half-mile from her cottage, past the vicarage and the cluster of thatched roofs that marked the village's heart. As she approached, the air grew cooler, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The grove was an ancient place. Its gnarled oaks whispered to have stood since the days of Cromwell. Locals avoided it at night, citing tales of ghosts or smugglers, but Miss Marple dismissed such nonsense. Fear, she knew, was often a cloak for secrets, and secrets were precisely what she sought. She slowed her pace as the grove came into view, its shadowed canopy swallowing the moonlight. The note had mentioned a clearing near the tallest oak, marked by a circle of stones. She spotted it now, a faint glow flickering within a lantern, perhaps, or a fire. Voices, low and urgent, drifted toward her, carried on the wind. She crouched behind a thicket of brambles, her knees protesting but her resolve unshaken. From her vantage point, she could see the clearing. A small fire burned in a makeshift pit, casting wavering shadows on the faces of those gathered. There were 5 figures, their silhouettes distinct against the firelight. She recognized them instantly, a testament to her encyclopedic knowledge of St. Mary Mead's inhabitants. There was Mayor Harold Winthrop, his portly frame unmistakable even in a heavy coat. Beside him stood Mrs. Eleanor Price, the postmistress, her sharp features soft by the glow, but her posture rigid with authority. Dr. Samuel Haydock, the village physician, paced nervously, his hands clasped behind his back. The other 2 were less familiar. A tall man with a hawkish nose, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the rustic setting, and a woman with a scarf draped over her head, her face obscured, but her movements quick and precise. Miss Marple strained to hear their words, her breath shallow to avoid rustling the leaves. The mayor's voice, usually booming at village council meetings, was hushed but insistent. The syndicate demands results, Eleanor. The next shipment must clear the port by week's end, or we'll lose the buyer. Mrs. Price's response was sharp like the snap of a twig. Don't lecture me, Harold. I've ensured the ledgers are clean. The problem is your man at the docks. He's getting careless. Careless? Dr. Haydock interjected, his voice quivering. If he's caught, it's all of us who'll pay. The syndicate doesn't forgive mistakes. The hawkish man raised a hand, silencing them. His voice was smooth, almost melodic, but carried a chilling edge. Enough, the council has spoken. We move forward, or we face consequences. The Shadow Council doesn't tolerate dissent. Miss Marple's mind raced. Syndicate, Shadow Council. These were not the petty squabbles of village life-lost chickens or disputed fence lines. This was something larger, something sinister, weaving its tendrils through her quiet corner of the world. She shifted slightly, her foot brushing against a stone. The faint clink was barely audible, but the scarf-draped woman's head snapped toward the thicket. Miss Marple froze, her heart pounding as the woman's gaze lingered, her eyes glinting in the firelight like a cat's. "Who's there?" the woman called, her voice low but commanding. The group fell silent, their heads turning as one. "Miss." Marple pressed herself lower, her cheek brushing the damp earth. She could smell the moss and the faint tang of smoke from the fire. The woman took a step toward the thicket, her hand slipping into her coat pocket. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her walking stick, ready to bolt if needed. Though she knew her aging limbs were no match for a chase, the hawkish man spoke again, his tone impatient. "Lydia, leave it. It's just a fox or some village. Drunk stumbling home. We're wasting time." Lydia hesitated, then retreated to the circle, but her eyes lingered on the shadows. Miss Marple exhaled silently, her pulse steadying. She needed to hear more, but she couldn't risk discovery. The group resumed their discussion, their voices dropping even lower. She caught fragments, something about a delivery and a contact in London, but the specifics eluded her. Then, as the mayor reached into his coat, she saw it, a folded piece of paper, passed to the hawkish man, who tucked it into his breast pocket with a nod. The meeting was winding down. The fire was doused, plunging the clearing into darkness, save for the faint glow of the lantern the mayor carried. The group dispersed, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves as they vanished into the night. Miss Marple waited, counting to 100 to ensure they were gone. Her knees ached, but she ignored the discomfort, her mind fixed on that paper. It was a clue, a tangible thread in this unraveling tapestry of deceit. She rose cautiously, scanning the grove. The clearing was empty, the fire reduced to smoldering embers. She crept forward, her eyes darting to the shadows. The mayor's lantern had bobbed toward the east, toward the old mill road, but she couldn't be sure he was alone. Then she saw it a glint of white against the dark earth, near where the hawkish man had stood. The paper. It must have slipped from his pocket as he tucked it away. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, the paper crinkling softly. It was a single sheet, folded tightly, with a faint wax seal broken at the edge. She didn't dare unfold it here, not with the risk of someone returning. Tucking it into her shawl, she turned to leave, her steps quickening as she retraced her path through the grove. The night seemed to close in around her, the trees whispering secrets of their own. Then she heard a snap of a branch, sharp and deliberate, not 10 yards behind her. She froze, her breath catching. The sound came. Again, closer now, accompanied by the soft crunch of leaves. Someone was following her. Her mind raced through options. She could confront them, but she was unarmed save for her walking stick. She could run, but the uneven ground would betray her. No, she needed to outwit them, as she always had. She spotted a narrow path veering toward the stream that bordered the grove. It was overgrown, barely used, but it led to a footbridge that would take her back to the village's edge. She moved swiftly, her steps light, using the stick to probe for roots or stones. The sounds behind her grew fainter, but she didn't slow. The bridge appeared ahead, its wooden slats slick with moss. She crossed it carefully, her heart hammering as she glanced back. A shadow moved among the trees, tall and deliberate, but It didn't follow her across. Reaching the other side, she ducked behind a willow, its drooping branches shielding her from view. The shadow paused, then retreated, melting into the darkness. Miss Marple waited, counting her breaths, until the silence was absolute. Only then did she continue, her steps brisk but silent, until she reached the familiar glow of her cottage's windows. Inside she locked the door and drew the curtains before unfolding the paper. The fire in her hearth cast a warm glow over the cramped handwriting. It was a list of names, some familiar, some not, each followed by a cryptic alias and a number. Winthrop Badger -5,000, read one line. Price Sparrow 3,200, read another. At the bottom, a single phrase, "The eagle flies at dawn." Her lips pursed. A code, perhaps, or a signal. Whatever it was proof that the syndicate's roots ran deep, and she held the key to unearthing them. She folded the paper and slipped it into a tin box beneath her floorboards, a hiding place she'd used for years to store letters or keepsakes. As she settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mind was already racing ahead. The mayor, the postmistress, the doctor, they were pawns in a larger game. But who was the master? And what was the eagle's flight? She smiled faintly, the thrill of the chase warming her more than the fire. Tomorrow she would begin to unravel the puzzle, one thread at a time. The night outside was still, but Miss Marple knew the shadows held secrets yet to be uncovered, and she, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, was ready to face them. The village of St. Mary Mead woke to a gray dawn, the air thick with the promise of rain. Miss Marple rose early, her routine unchanged despite the late hour of her return. She boiled water for tea, her movements precise, her thoughts elsewhere. The stolen paper weighed heavily on her mind, its cryptic contents, a puzzle she was determined to solve. She sipped her tea, staring out at the garden, where her roses drooped under the weight of dew. The world outside looked unchanged, but she knew better. Beneath the surface, a current of deceit ran through her village, and she was its unwitting sentinel. Her first task was to confirm the identities on the list. She knew Winthrop and Price, of course, but the aliases Badger, Sparrow suggested a code, perhaps tied to their roles in the syndicate. The numbers, too, intrigued her. Were they sums of money, quantities of goods, or something else entirely? She needed more context, and that meant delving deeper into the village's underbelly. She dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, the picture of unassuming respectability, and set out for the post office. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was a key figure in last night's meeting, and Miss Marple suspected the post office was more than a hub for letters. It was a place where information flowed, letters, telegrams, parcels, all potential conduits for the syndicate's schemes. The post office was a small stone building with a cheerful red door, its windows adorned with posters about postal rates and war bonds. Inside, Mrs. Price stood behind the counter, sorting mail with brisk efficiency. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes flicked up as Miss Marple entered, a smile masking the wariness beneath. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, her voice smooth. "Out early today, aren't you?" "Oh, you know me, Eleanor," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. "I like a morning walk to clear the head. I thought I'd post a letter to my nephew, Raymond. He's been so busy in London, I scarcely hear from him. She produced a sealed envelope, a prop she'd prepared that morning, addressed to Raymond West, with no real content inside. As Mrs. Price took it, Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes catching the edge of a ledger peeking from beneath a stack of envelopes. It was open to a page with columns of numbers, not unlike those on the stolen list. "Busy morning?" Miss Marple asked, nodding toward the counter. "You've quite the pile there." Mrs. Price's smile tightened. "Oh, just the usual. Parcels and such. Everyone's sending things this time of year." Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland. "Of course. Though I did notice a rather odd parcel the other day, big, with a queer sort of stamp. Foreign, perhaps? I suppose you see all sorts coming through." Mrs. Price's fingers paused just for a moment before resuming their sorting. "Foreign stamps aren't so unusual," she said. "We get them from time to time. Nothing to remark on." But Miss Marple had seen the flicker in her eyes, the slight stiffening of her shoulders. She was hiding something. Miss Marple thanked her, paid for the postage, and left, her mind cataloguing every detail. The ledger, the foreign stamps, the guarded tone it all pointed to the post office as a nerve center for the syndicate's operations. Her next stop was the tea shop, a bustling hub of gossip where she could observe without drawing attention. She took her usual seat by the window, her knitting in her lap, and ordered a pot of Earl Grey. The shop was abuzz with chatter, Mrs. Bantry lamenting her lost cat, Mr. Pye fussing over his gardenias, but Miss Marple's ears were tuned to quieter exchanges. Two men at a corner table, strangers to her, spoke in low tones, their heads bent over a map. One wore a heavy coat, despite the warmth of the room, and the other kept glancing at the door. She sipped her tea, her needles clicking rhythmically, and let her eyes wander. The map was small, folded to show a section of the coast, perhaps the port town mentioned in the grove. She couldn't see details, but the men's urgency was clear. One of them muttered something about the Eagle and Miss Marple's. Pulse quickened, the phrase from the list. She needed that map. Opportunity came when the men stepped outside for a cigarette, leaving their table unattended. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow to avoid suspicion, and approached the counter to pay. As she passed their table, she stumbled, her knitting bag brushing against the map, with a deft flick of her wrist, honed by years of card games with her nephew. She palmed the map and tucked it into her bag. No one noticed. To the other patrons, she was just a clumsy old lady. Back at her cottage, she unfolded the map. It was a hand-drawn sketch of the port, with a dock circled in red ink, and a time scrawled beside it. Dawn Thursday. The Eagle's flight, she realized, was likely a shipment, and Thursday was only 2 days away. She needed to act quickly, but she couldn't do it alone. She'd penned a letter to Raymond, this time a real one, asking him to visit. His sharp mind and city connections could help her decode the list and plan her next move. As she sealed the envelope, a knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess. They found my cat, but he was in the oak grove of all places. And there were footprints, big ones, not like a villager's. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple smiled, her mind racing. "The shadowy figure from last night, perhaps?" "How curious," she said, her tone mild. "I'll have to think on it, Dolly. Care for some tea?" As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The syndicate was closer than she'd imagined, their tracks crisscrossing her village. But she had the list, the map, and her wits. The game was afoot, and Miss Marple was ready to play. The next evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the stolen list spread before her. She'd spent the day cross-referencing names with village records, her memory a steel trap for details. The hawkish man, she'd learned, was a Mr. Victor Klein, a lawyer from London who'd recently bought a cottage on the village outskirts. The scarf-draped woman, Lydia, was harder to place, but a passing remark from Mrs. Bantry about a new seamstress, with a sharp tongue, gave her a lead. The numbers, she suspected, were payments or quantities, but without more context. They were just figures on a page. Raymond arrived at dusk, his car rattling up the lane. He was a tall, lean man with a writer's restless energy, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Aunt Jane," he said, kissing her cheek, "your letter sounded urgent. What's this about a mystery?" She poured him tea and showed him the list, recounting the midnight gathering in careful detail. Raymond's eyebrows rose as he read the names. "Winthrop? Price? This is no small thing, Aunt Jane. If they're mixed up in something crooked, it could go all the way to London." "London?" "Precisely," she said, tapping the map. "And this Eagle business Thursday at the port. I need to know what they're moving and why." Raymond grinned, his skepticism melting into admiration. "You've been busy, but you can't go to the port alone. It's too dangerous." "Dangerous?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear Raymond, I've faced worse than a few smugglers in my time, but I'll admit your help would be welcome." They spent the evening poring over the list and map, Raymond's city knowledge filling gaps in her village-centric view. He recognized one named Lord Grayson, a minor aristocrat with a manor nearby, as a man rumored to dabble in shady deals. "He's got a reputation," Raymond said. "Nothing proven, but he's got friends in high places and low ones." "Then he's our next step," Miss Marple said. "There's a charity event at his manor tomorrow. I'll find a way in. You, meanwhile, can check with your London contacts about this Klein fellow." Raymond nodded, though his expression was wary. "Be careful, Aunt Jane. These people aren't playing games." She smiled, her needles clicking. "Oh, but I am, Raymond, and I play to win." The charity event at Grayson Manor was the talk of St. Mary Mead, a glittering affair to raise funds for a new hospital wing. Miss Marple secured an invitation through Mrs. Bantry, who was delighted to have her friend along. Dressed in a modest but elegant frock, Miss Marple arrived at the manor, her eyes scanning the crowd. Lord Grayson was there, a tall man with a silver mane and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He greeted guests with practiced charm, but Miss Marple noticed his gaze linger on certain faces, Klein among them. She mingled, her ears tuned to snippets of conversation. A woman mentioned a shipment delayed by weather. A man complained about customs trouble at the port. Each fragment was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple collected them all. Then she saw it, Klein slipping into a side corridor, a key glinting in his hand. She followed, her steps silent on the polished floor. The corridor led to a heavy oak door, locked tight. Klein glanced around, then unlocked it and slipped inside. Miss Marple waited, her heart steady despite the risk. When the corridor was clear, she approached the door, her fingers brushing the lock. It was a long shot, but she had a hairpin and a lifetime of ingenuity. The lock clicked after a tense minute, and she eased the door open. The room was small, lined with bookshelves and a single desk. On it lay a ledger, open to a page of transactions, dates, amounts, and coded names matching the stolen list. She memorized what she could, her eyes darting to the door. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. She slipped behind a curtain. Her breath held as Klein re-entered, muttering to himself. He didn't stay long, locking the door as he left. Miss Marple waited, then emerged, her mind racing. The ledger was the key, but she couldn't take it, not yet. She needed more proof, something undeniable. As she left the manor, blending into the departing guests, she felt the weight of her mission. The syndicate was real, its reach vast, and she was one step closer to exposing it. Back at her cottage, she wrote down what she'd seen, her handwriting neat despite the late hour. The eagle's flight was imminent, and she would be there to meet it. The shadows of St. Mary Mead were no match for Miss Jane Marple, and she would see this through to the end. Chapter 3. The Codebreaker's Puzzle. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat, her fingers drumming lightly against a chipped teacup. Before her lay the stolen scrap of paper from the midnight gathering, its edges frayed, ink smudged but legible. The list of names, or rather aliases, stared back at her, a puzzle wrapped in a riddle. Each name was paired with a cryptic string of letters and numbers, like Raven's Claw, J4K9, or Iron Sparrow, P7Q2. To anyone else, it might have seemed a merchant's inventory or a child's game, but to Miss Marple it was a key to the shadowy syndicate that had infiltrated her quiet village of St. Mary Mead. She adjusted her spectacles, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she traced a finger along the first alias, Silver Fox, L2M8. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, as if the writer feared their own flourish might betray them. "A cautious hand," she murmured, "but not cautious enough." The air in the cottage was still, save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock, yet her mind buzzed with possibilities. The syndicate's influence, she suspected, stretched far beyond the village, weaving through the region's commerce like ivy through a trellis. But how to prove it? The list was a start, but it demanded decoding, and Miss Marple was no stranger to the art of unraveling secrets hidden in plain sight. She rose, her lavender cardigan slipping slightly as she moved to the bookshelf, pulling down a worn copy of the Vicar's Almanac, a tome of local history she'd long used to cross-reference. Village gossip. Gossip, she knew, was often the skeleton key to locked mysteries. The almanac's pages crinkled as she flipped to a section on local businesses, bakeries, butchers, tailors, and the like. If the aliases corresponded to trades, as she suspected, then the village's own chatter might hold the clues to their meaning. The kettle whistled, and she poured herself another cup of Earl Grey, the steam curling like a question mark. As she sipped, her thoughts drifted to the mayor, Mr. Clarence Tuttle, whose nervous demeanor at the midnight gathering had struck her as odd. A man of his stature, fidgeting like a schoolboy, caught with stolen sweets. Surely he was no mastermind, but a pawn, perhaps. And then there was Mrs. Harrow, the postmistress, whose sharp eyes missed nothing at the post office. Could she be linked to one of these aliases? Miss Marple jotted a note in her neat, looping script. Check Mrs. Harrow's ledgers for unusual postmarks. A knock at the door startled her, though her expression remained serene. She tucked the list beneath a cushion and opened the door to find her nephew, Raymond West, his tweed jacket slightly askew from the train ride. His dark hair was tousled, and his grin was as boyish as ever, though he was well into his 30s. "Aunt Jane," he exclaimed, sweeping her into a brief hug. "I hope I'm not interrupting one of your famous knitting sessions." "Not at all, dear," she said, her voice warm but her eyes sharp, already assessing his mood. Raymond was a writer, prone to flights of fancy, but his quick mind had often proved useful. "Come in, have some tea. I could use your perspective on a little puzzle." Raymond's eyebrows shot up as he settled into a chintz armchair, accepting a cup. "A puzzle? In St. Mary Mead? Don't tell me the vicar's been hiding a scandal in the Himmels." Miss Marple chuckled, retrieving the list and placing it before him. "Nothing so ecclesiastical, I'm afraid, but look at this. Tell me what you see." Raymond's eyes scanned the paper, his fingers tapping a rhythm on his knee. Aliases, clearly. And these codes J4K9, P7Q2 look like ciphers. Maybe a substitution code? Or something tied to a specific key? He leaned forward, his writer's curiosity piqued. "Where did you get this, Aunt Jane? You haven't been robbing banks, have you?" She smiled faintly, folding her hands. "Let's just say I overheard something I wasn't meant to. These names, I believe, are tied to people in the village or beyond. People with influence, perhaps, who don't wish to be known." Raymond whistled softly. "A secret society in St. Mary Mead? That's a plot twist even I couldn't dream." "Up. Not a society, dear," she corrected gently. "A syndicate. One with its fingers in trade, politics, perhaps even crime. But to prove it, we must crack this code." For the next hour, they pored over the list, Raymond scribbling theories on a notepad while Miss Marple cross-referenced names with her almanac. The alias Iron Sparrow caught her eye, paired with the code P7Q2. "Sparrow," she mused. "Mrs. Finch, the seamstress, has a shop called Sparrow's Needle, and her husband was a blacksmith before he passed iron, perhaps?" Raymond nodded, jotting it down. P7Q2 could be a reference to her ledger. Page 7, quadrant 2, or something less literal, like a date or address. Miss Marple's lips twitched. "You're thinking like a novelist, Raymond. Let's try something simpler. The almanac lists Sparrow's Needle as number 7 on High Street. Perhaps P stands for page, and Q2 is a quadrant of her records." They tested the theory with other aliases. Raven's claw pointed to Mr. Blackwood, the butcher, whose shop was at 4 Kings Lane, J4 perhaps. Silver Fox was trickier, but Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Harrow's fondness for silver jewelry and her post office at 2 Market Road. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The codes seemed to map to addresses or business records, cleverly disguised to look random. But the final alias, Golden Owl, X9Y1, stumped them. No business in St. Mary Mead matched Owl, and the code didn't align with any known address. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she thought. "It's not in the village," she said at last. "The syndicate's reach is wider. This could point to a place outside St. Mary Mead, perhaps a manor or estate." Raymond snapped his fingers. "Grayson Manor. It's just outside the village, owned by that reclusive Lord Grayson. Owls are wise, secretive creatures, and golden could hint at wealth. Plus, X9Y1 doesn't fit the village grid, maybe. It's a map coordinate. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Very good, Raymond. Grayson Manor hosts a charity event this weekend. I think I shall attend as a curious old lady with a penchant for good causes. Raymond laughed, shaking his head. Aunt Jane, you're more dangerous than half the detectives in London. But be careful. If this syndicate is as powerful as you think, they won't take kindly to being sniffed out. She patted his hand, her smile serene but steely. My dear, I've faced worse than a few shadowy figures. Now help me fetch my best hat. I have a manor to visit. The next morning, Miss Marple sat at her desk, the list tucked safely in a locked drawer. She penned a letter to her friend Dolly Bantry, whose knack for local gossip rivaled her own. Dolly's husband, Colonel Bantry, had once mentioned Lord Grayson's odd habits, late-night deliveries, guarded gates. If Golden Owl was indeed Grayson, Miss Marple needed more than a hunch. She sealed the letter, slipped it into her handbag, and set off for the post office. Mrs. Harrow was behind the counter, her silver brooch glinting as she sorted mail. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her smile a touch too bright. "Another letter to Dolly? You two must have quite the correspondence." "Oh, just keeping up with old friends," Miss Marple replied, her tone airy but her eyes noting the flicker of curiosity in Mrs. Harrow's gaze. She handed over the letter, watching, as Mrs. Harrow stamped it with more force than necessary. Silver Fox, Miss Marple thought. I'll be watching you, too. Back home, she pulled out a map of the region, spreading it across the table. Grayson Manor lay 3 miles north, a sprawling estate surrounded by dense woods. If X9Y1 was a coordinate, it might point to a specific spot on the grounds, a shed, a cellar, or something more clandestine. She traced the map's grid, her finger pausing at a junction near the manor's stables. X9Y1, she murmured. A place to hide something valuable. The day passed in a flurry of preparation. Miss Marple ironed her best dress, a modest navy frock with a high collar, and polished her brooch, a simple pearl that doubled as a listening device, a gift from a retired inspector friend. She packed a small notebook, a pencil, and a pair of gloves to avoid fingerprints. Raymond, staying at the vicarage, promised to check in by evening, his writer's imagination already spinning tales of her adventure. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind racing. The syndicate was no mere village scheme. Its tendrils reached into the manor, perhaps even to London. The aliases, the codes, the midnight meetings, they were pieces of a larger mosaic, one she was determined to complete. She glanced at the clock, 6:47 p.m. The charity event was 2 days away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through her fingers like sand. The following day, Miss Marple visited the village library, a quaint building with sagging shelves and a musty scent. She browsed the local history section, ostensibly for a book on gardening, but her real aim was to dig into Grayson Manor's past. The librarian, Miss Tuttle, no relation to the mayor, was a font of knowledge, if a bit too eager to chat. Grayson Manor, you say? Miss Tuttle adjusted her glasses, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Old Lord Grayson, the current one's father, was a queer sort. Kept to himself, but there were rumors of odd visitors, foreigners, some said with heavy accents. And that stable fire in '09? Never fully explained. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. Fascinating, dear. Any records on the manor's layout? For my historical interest. Miss Tuttle produced a faded blueprint, part of an old survey. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the stables, noting a small outbuilding marked storage at the X9Y1 grid point. Her pulse quickened. A hiding place, she thought. She thanked Miss Tuttle profusely, slipping a peppermint from her handbag as a token of gratitude. That evening Raymond returned, his face flushed with excitement. I did some digging of my own, Aunt Jane. Talked to a chap at the pub who used to work at Grayson's stables. Says there's a locked shed out back, never opened, even for the staff. Sounds like your X9Y1 spot. Miss Marple's lips curved. Well done, Raymond. Now let's see if we can't make sense of the rest of this puzzle before the event. They spent the night decoding the remaining aliases, cross-referencing them with village records. Raven's Claw was indeed Mr. Blackwood, whose butcher shop had been receiving late-night deliveries of special cuts that never appeared on the counter. Iron Sparrow was Mrs. Finch, whose sewing orders included peculiarly heavy packages shipped to unknown addresses. Each discovery tightened the web, but Golden Owl remained the keystone dot as midnight approached. Miss Marple felt a thrill she hadn't known since her youth. The syndicate was clever, but they hadn't counted on an old spinster with a knack for noticing what others missed. She tucked the blueprint into her handbag, her resolve hardening. Grayson Manor awaited, and with it, the next piece of the puzzle dot. The morning of the charity event dawned crisp and clear, the sky a pale blue that promised a fine day. Miss Marple, dressed with care, her navy frock offset by a cream shawl and that trusty pearl brooch. She arrived at Grayson Manor by hired car, her demeanor that of a harmless old lady eager to support the local hospital fund. The manor's gates loomed iron and imposing, but the grounds were alive with guests, ladies in pastel dresses, gentlemen in morning coats, and servants weaving through with trays of lemonade. Lord Grayson greeted her at the entrance, his silver hair gleaming, his smile polished but cold. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "I trust you'll enjoy the event." "Oh, I'm sure I shall," she replied, her eyes twinkling with a guile he didn't suspect. She mingled, her ears attuned to every whispered word, her gaze noting every glance. The stables were visible across the lawn, and the outbuilding, her X9Y, was half hidden by a copse of oaks dot. As the speeches began, Miss Marple slipped away, her steps light despite her age. The outbuilding was locked, as expected, but the blueprint had shown a loose panel on the western side. She found it, prying it open with a hairpin, and slipped inside. The air was damp, smelling of earth and oil. In the dim light she saw crates, stamped with unfamiliar symbols, and a ledger on a rickety table. Her gloved hands flipped through the pages, revealing transactions in coded shorthand. Shipments to Rotterdam, payments in unmarked bills, names she recognized from the syndicate's list. Her heart raced as she tore out a page, tucking it into her shawl. A creak outside made her freeze, but it was only the wind. She replaced the panel and returned to the crowd, her face serene as she sipped lemonade. The event ended without incident, and Miss Marple returned home, the stolen page burning a hole in her handbag. As she sat by the fire that night, she spread it out, her eyes tracing the coded entries. The syndicate's web was vast, but she had a thread to pull. Grayson Manor was no mere estate, it was a hub, and Lord Grayson, she was certain, was the golden owl. She leaned back, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. Tomorrow she would plan her next move, a discreet visit to the Manor's locked room, perhaps, or a chat with Mrs. Harrow to test her loyalties. For now, the puzzle was taking shape, and Miss Marple felt the quiet thrill of a hunter closing in on her prey. Chapter 4. The Manor's Secret. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone path leading to Grayson Manor, its golden rays filtering through the ancient oaks that guarded the estate. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her tweed hat, her gloved hands clutching a small wicker basket filled with homemade scones, a perfect pretext for her visit. The charity event at the Manor, organized to raise funds for a new village library, was the ideal opportunity for an inquisitive spinster to blend in unnoticed. Her heart beat a little faster than usual, not from exertion but from the thrill of the chase. The coded list she deciphered in her cottage had pointed her here, to Lord Grayson's imposing residence, and she was determined to uncover what secrets its stone walls concealed. As she approached the Manor's wrought iron gates, Miss Marple observed the flurry of activity. Carriages and motor cars lined the drive, their drivers exchanging pleasantries while footmen in crisp livery directed guests toward the grand entrance. The Manor itself was a study in contrasts. Its ivy-clad facade exuded old-world charm, but the modern electric lamps flanking the doors hinted at wealth and influence. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the details, a groundskeeper lingering too. Long near a side gate, a maid glancing nervously at a high window. Something was amiss, and she intended to find out what. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you," called Mrs. Bantry, bustling forward in a voluminous lavender dress, her face flushed with the excitement of the event. As the village's unofficial social queen, Dolly Bantry was in her element, organizing the charity tea with military precision. "You simply must try the cucumber sandwiches. They're divine." "Oh, Dolly, you're too kind," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her eyes twinkling. "I brought some scones, nothing fancy, just a little something for the table." Mrs. Bantry beamed, linking arms with her. "You're a treasure, Jane. Come, let's get you settled. Lord Grayson's promised a tour of the gardens later, and I hear he's unveiling a new rose varietal." Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind already mapping the Manor's layout. The crowd was a mix of St. Mary Mead's gentry and curious. Outsiders, businessmen from London, a few county officials, and a smattering of local shopkeepers hoping to curry favor. She scanned their faces, cataloging expressions and interactions. A tall man with a waxed mustache lingered near the refreshment table, his eyes darting to the Manor's upper windows. A young woman in a maid's uniform adjusted a tray of pastries, with unnatural precision, her fingers trembling slightly. Miss Marple filed these observations away, her instincts humming. The tea was set up in the Manor's expansive drawing-room, its high ceilings adorned with frescoes of cherubs and vines. Crystal chandeliers glittered above long tables draped in white linen, laden with tiered trays of sandwiches, cakes, and glistening fruit tarts. Miss Marple accepted a cup of Darjeeling from a passing footman, her gaze drifting to the far end of the room where Lord Grayson held court. He was a man of late middle age, with silver hair and a commanding presence, his tailored suit accentuating his broad shoulders. His smile was polished, but Miss Marple noted the tightness around his eyes, the way his hand lingered on a guest's shoulder as if to steer the conversation. She drifted closer, her basket of scones a convenient prop as she offered them to nearby guests. "Oh, you must try one, Mr. Hargreaves," she said to the local butcher, who accepted with a grin. "Baked fresh this morning." As she moved through the crowd, she positioned herself near Grayson, catching snippets of his conversation with a portly man in a pinstriped suit. "The shipment arrives next week," Grayson murmured, his voice low. "Ensure the dock workers know their roles." The pinstriped man nodded, his jowls quivering. "All arranged, my lord. The crates are marked as you specified." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Shipment, crates. The words echoed the coded list. She deciphered, which mentioned deliveries and port schedules. She pretended to adjust her shawl, inching closer, but Grayson's eyes flicked toward her. For a moment their gazes met, and she saw a flash of calculation in his expression. She smiled demurely, raising her teacup. "Such a lovely event. Lord Grayson, the village is so grateful." His smile returned, smooth as glass. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Your reputation for generosity precedes you. I hope you're enjoying yourself?" "Oh, immensely," she replied, her tone light. "Though I confess I'm curious about the manor. Such history in these walls." Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gestured expansively. "Indeed. Perhaps you'll join the garden tour later? The rose garden is my pride and joy." "I wouldn't miss it," she said, her mind racing. She needed to explore beyond the public areas to find the locked room hinted at in the coded list. The mention of a secure chamber had been unmistakable, and her instincts told her it was key to unraveling the syndicate's operations. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple mingled, her unassuming presence allowing her to eavesdrop without suspicion. She overheard a footman whisper to a maid about the upstairs guard, and noted a heavy-set man in an ill-fitting suit stationed near a staircase, his hand resting on a bulge at his hip. A guard, she thought, and not a subtle one. The locked room was likely upstairs, and she needed a way to slip past, unnoticed. Her opportunity came when Mrs. Bantry announced the garden tour. The guests surged toward the French doors leading to the terrace, leaving the drawing-room momentarily quiet. Miss Marple lingered, feigning interest in a portrait of a stern-faced Grayson ancestor. As the last stragglers exited, she glanced at the guard by the staircase. He was distracted, chatting with a maid who seemed eager to keep his attention. Miss Marple seized her chance, slipping behind a velvet curtain and ascending a narrow servant's staircase she'd spotted earlier. The upper hallway was dimly lit, its oak-paneled walls lined with portraits and heavy tapestries. She moved silently, her sensible shoes muffled on the thick carpet. The coded list had mentioned a room at the east end, behind a brass-bound door. She counted the doors, her heart pounding as she reached the easternmost one. It was indeed brass-bound, with a heavy lock that gleamed in the faint light. She tested the handle locked as expected. Miss Marple reached into her handbag, retrieving a set of hairpins she'd brought for just such an occasion. Her nephew Raymond had once teased her about her old-fashioned skills, but she'd learned lock-picking from a retired burglar in St. Mary Mead years ago. a man whose remorse had made him an unlikely ally. Her fingers worked deftly, the pins probing the lock's tumblers. After a tense moment, a soft click rewarded her efforts. She eased the door open, slipping inside and closing it behind her. The room was a study, its walls lined with bookshelves, and a massive mahogany desk dominating the center. A single window overlooked the gardens, where the tour was in full swing, Grayson's voice carrying faintly through the glass. Miss Marple moved quickly, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. A filing cabinet in the corner caught her attention. Its top drawer slightly ajar. She opened it, revealing a stack of folders labeled with cryptic initials. Flipping through them, she found invoices for shipments of agricultural equipment to ports in France and Spain, unlikely, given Grayson's lack of farming interests. Her fingers paused on a ledger marked SC Transactions. The entries listed sums in the thousands, with annotations like port clearance and overseas transfer. Her breath caught. This was evidence of the syndicate's financial dealings far beyond St. Mary Mead's borders. A sudden noise, a heavy footstep in the hallway, made her freeze. She slipped the ledger's top page into her handbag, her movements swift but silent. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a low murmur in a foreign accent. "Check the study. He said it's secure, but I don't trust those villagers." "Miss?" Marple's eyes darted around the room. The desk was too exposed, the bookshelves too open. Her gaze landed on a heavy tapestry depicting a hunting scene. She darted behind it, pressing herself against the cold stone wall as the door creaked open. Two men entered, their voices sharp with urgency. "If anyone's been in here, Grayson'll have our heads," one said, his accent thick Eastern. "European, perhaps?" Miss Marple held her breath, her heart hammering. "Relax, Victor," the other replied, his tone smoother. "The lock's intact. Probably just a servant forgetting to close the drawer." They rummaged through the room, their boots scuffing the floor. Miss Marple's legs ached from standing motionless, but she didn't dare move. After an agonizing minute, the men left, the door clicking shut behind them. She waited, counting to 60, before emerging. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the tapestry, ensuring it looked untouched. The ledger page in her handbag felt like a burning coal, urging her to escape. But as she reached for the door, she noticed a small brass key on the desk, half hidden under a blotter. Her instincts screamed to take it. It matched the description of a secondary lock from the coded list, possibly for another secure area. She slipped it into her pocket, her mind racing with possibilities. The hallway was empty, but voices echoed from the main staircase. The garden tour must have ended, and guests were returning. Miss Marple hurried back to the servants' staircase, descending just as a group of chattering ladies entered the drawing-room. She re-emerged behind the curtain, smoothing her skirt and rejoining the crowd, as if she'd never left. "Miss Marple, there you are," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, waving her over. "You missed the roses. Lord Grayson was just telling us about his new hybrid." "Oh, I'm sure it was lovely," Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "I got a bit lost admiring the portraits." As the event wound down, she excused herself, citing a headache. The key and ledger page weighed heavily in her handbag as she walked back to St. Mary Mead, the setting sun casting her shadow long and thin. She'd uncovered a piece of the syndicate's puzzle, But the foreign voices and guarded room suggested a deeper, more dangerous web. Back at her cottage, she'd pore over the ledger page, cross-referencing it with her notes. For now, though, she allowed herself a small smile. The manor's secret was hers, and she was one step closer to dismantling the Shadow Council. The evening air was cool as Miss Marple reached her garden gate, the familiar scent of lavender calming her nerves. She glanced back at the road, half expecting to see a shadowy figure trailing her, but the lane was empty. Inside, she lit a lamp and spread the ledger page on her table, its numbers and cryptic notes a tantalizing puzzle. The key, small and unassuming, glinted beside it. She didn't yet know what it unlocked, but she was certain it held the next clue in her fearless stand against the syndicate. Chapter 5. The Locked Room. The storm battered St. Mary Mead with unrelenting fury, its winds howling like a chorus of restless spirits. Rain lashed against the windows of Miss Jane Marple's quaint cottage, the panes rattling as if protesting the intrusion of the tempest. Inside, the spinster sat in her favorite armchair, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her sharp eyes glinting in the flickering light of a single oil lamp. Before her, on the polished oak table, lay the stolen key from Lord Grayson's manor. A small, ornate thing, its brass surface etched with faint curlicues that hinted at secrets. Her fingers, nimble despite their years, turned it over, catching the lamplight's gleam. The key was her prize, her gateway to the heart of the syndicates. Machinations, and tonight she would wield it. Miss Marple had planned meticulously. The manor, perched on the hill overlooking the village, was a fortress of stone and shadow, its Gothic arches and ivy-clad walls hiding more than just old money. The charity event 2 nights prior had revealed its underbelly, guarded rooms, whispered deals, and Lord Grayson's voice, smooth as velvet but laced with menace, discussing a shipment in a foreign tongue. The key, pilfered during her daring escape, unlocked a room she suspected held the syndicate's darkest truths. Tonight, under the storm's cover, she would infiltrate that room. She rose, her movements deliberate, and donned a dark woolen coat, its hem brushing her sensible shoes. A scarf, knitted by her own hands, concealed her silver hair, and she tucked a small notebook and pencil into her pocket. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with the quiet thrill of purpose. The village clock struck 11, its chimes, muffled by the gale, and Miss Marple slipped out into the night. The path to the manor was treacherous, the cobblestones slick with rain. She navigated by memory, her umbrella useless against the wind's ferocity. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the manor's silhouette, a brooding giant against the roiling clouds. Miss Marple's mind churned, piecing together fragments. The coded list from the midnight gathering, the mayor's nervous glances, the foreign voice in the manor's hall. The syndicate was no mere village scheme. Its tendrils stretched far, perhaps to London or beyond. The locked room was her next move in this intricate chess game, and she intended to play it flawlessly at the manor's iron gate. She paused. The grounds were silent save for the storm's roar, the usual patrols likely driven indoors. She slipped through a gap in the hedge, her slight frame an advantage in the shadows. The key burned in her pocket, a promise and a risk. The manor's side entrance, used by servants, was her target. She crept along the gravel path, her steps soft, avoiding the glow of lanterns hung near the main doors. A sudden gust tore at her scarf, and she clutched it tightly, her pulse quickening, not from the cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. Side door was unguarded, its lock rusted but yielding to her gentle pressure. Inside, the manor was a labyrinth of dark corridors, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and old secrets. Miss Marple moved with the grace of a spectre, her memory of the charity event guiding her to the west wing. The locked room was on the second floor, tucked behind a tapestry of a stag hunt, a detail she'd noted when a servant's glance lingered too long. Her shoes whispered against the parquet as she climbed the grand staircase, each step a calculated risk dot at the tapestry. She paused, listening. The storm's din masked her presence, but it also cloaked any approaching footsteps. She lifted the heavy fabric, revealing a plain oak door, its lock gleaming in the faint light from a distant sconce. The key slid in smoothly, its click swallowed by a thunderclap. Miss Marple pushed the door open, her breath catching as she stepped into the unknown. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound ledgers. A single desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered, with papers, an inkwell, and a brass candelabra, unlit. Rain battered the lone window, its leaded panes rattling. Miss Marple closed the door behind her, her fingers lingering on the key now back in her pocket. She lit the candelabra with a match. From her coat, the flame casting jagged shadows across the room. Her eyes scanned the shelves, sharp and methodical. Searching for the syndicate's pulse dot, she began with the ledgers, her gloved hands flipping through pages of meticulous handwriting. Numbers danced in columns, dates, amounts, cryptic abbreviations. One entry caught her eye. Port side, 12 thirds, 10 kVk. Victor Klein, the suave lawyer from the village, perhaps. Another read, Ashford L. 15,000 transit. Lady Ashford, the London financier. The pieces were aligning, each entry a thread in the syndicate's web. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. The thrill of discovery was a tonic no. Tea could match. She moved to the desk, sifting through papers. A letter, half finished, bore Grayson's looping signature. It mentioned a delivery to the continent, with a date 3 days hence. Her heart quickened. This was no petty village scheme, but a smuggling operation, perhaps arms or contraband. She tucked the letter into her notebook, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the truth. A sudden noise, a creak, from the corridor froze her. The candelabra's flame flickered as if sensing danger. Miss Marple extinguished it, plunging the room into darkness save for the storm's intermittent flashes. She slipped behind a heavy curtain, her breath shallow, her body pressed against the cold stone wall. The door creaked open, and heavy footsteps entered, deliberate and unhurried. "Check the desk," a voice growled, low and rough, not Grayson's polished tones. A second set of footsteps joined, lighter, hesitant. "He said it's here somewhere." "Miss?" Marple's mind raced. Grayson must suspect a breach. Perhaps the missing key had been noticed. She clutched her notebook, the stolen letter, a burning weight. The intruders rummaged, papers rustling, drawers slamming. A flash of lightning revealed 2 figures. One broad-shouldered, likely a guard, the other slighter, perhaps a clerk. They hadn't seen her, but the curtain was a flimsy shield. "Found it," the lighter voice said, holding up a small ledger. "This one's got the codes." "Then we burn the rest," the guard replied. "No traces." Miss Marple's heart sank. Destroy the evidence? She couldn't allow it. But confronting them was suicide 2 against 1, and she was no brawler. Her mind, her sharpest weapon, churned for a solution. The window risky, but possible. She edged toward it, her movements silent as the guard struck a match. The smell of sulphur filled the air, and a small flame licked at a stack of papers. She reached the window, her fingers fumbling with the latch. It was stuck, rusted from disuse. The guard's back was to her, the clerk muttering about haste. Miss Marple pressed harder, her strength surprising even herself, and the latch gave way with a faint squeak. She froze, but the storm's roar drowned it out. The window swung open, rain pelting her face as she scanned the ledge outside. A narrow stone rim ran along the manor's exterior, barely wide enough for her feet. The guard turned, his match casting shadows. What was that? Miss Marple didn't wait. She slipped through the window, her coat snagging briefly, and pressed herself against the wall. The ledge was slick, the wind clawing at her. Below, the manor's grounds were a dark void, the fall fatal. She inched along, her fingers gripping the stone, her heart pounding, but her resolve ironclad. The stolen letter, the ledger page, she had to protect them. Inside, the guard's voice grew louder. Windows open, someone's been here. Miss Marple moved faster, her shoes slipping but holding. The ledge curved toward a drain pipe, her only hope. She reached it, her hands wrapping around the cold metal, and began her descent. The pipe groaned under her weight, but it held. Rain soaked her through, her scarf clinging to her face, but she didn't falter. The ground met her feet, and she ducked into the shadows of a yew tree, her breath ragged but triumphant. The manor's lights flared as an alarm sounded, faint against the storm. Miss Marple didn't linger. She darted through the grounds, her path memorized, avoiding the gravel for silence. The hedge loomed, and she slipped through, emerging onto the muddy path to St. Mary Mead. Her cottage was a beacon in her mind, its warmth a promise. Back home, she locked the door, her hands trembling as she lit the lamp. The stolen letter and ledger page lay on her table, damp but intact. She spread them out, her eyes scanning the numbers, the names: Klein, Ashford, ports, dates. The syndicate's financial web was vast, its profits staggering. This was no village gossip. This was power, corruption, a shadow council pulling strings. Across counties, perhaps countries. She sank into her armchair, the storm still raging outside. The key, the letter, the ledger page, they were her weapons now, each a step closer to dismantling the syndicate. But Grayson's men were alert, the manor no longer safe. She'd need allies, Inspector Davies, perhaps, or the mysterious stranger who'd hinted at defection. Her mind spun, plotting, as the fire crackled, and the night deepened. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles idle for once. The game was dangerous, the stakes higher than any village scandal. But she was no stranger to shadows, and this syndicate, for all its cunning, had underestimated Jane Marple. She would unravel them thread by thread until their empire was nothing but ash. Chapter 6. The Stranger's Warning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone paths of St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of gold and amber. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The ledger page she'd pilfered from Lord Grayson's manor lay tucked inside her well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, its cryptic figures haunting her. The syndicate's web was vast, its threads woven through commerce and corruption, and she was only beginning to untangle it. Yet the weight of her discovery pressed against her calm exterior, urging her to act swiftly as she adjusted a stitch. A shadow fell across her rose bushes. She glanced up, her sharp eyes catching a figure at the garden gate, a man, lean and weathered, his coat too heavy for the mild autumn day. His hat was pulled low, obscuring his face, but his posture betrayed a nervous energy. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice warm but laced with the faintest edge of curiosity. "May I help you?" The man hesitated, his fingers twitching at the gate's latch. "Miss Marple?" His voice was low, with a faint trace of an accent she couldn't place, perhaps Eastern European, softened by years elsewhere. "I need to speak with you. Alone." She tilted her head, studying him. His eyes, visible now as he stepped closer, were a stormy gray, darting as if expecting pursuit. "You'll forgive me if I'm cautious," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Strangers don't often wander into my garden unannounced. Might I have your name?" He glanced over his shoulder, then pushed through the gate, closing it with a soft click. "Call me Stephen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have much time." "You're in danger, Miss Marple. You've been asking questions about things you shouldn't know." Her expression remained serene, though her mind raced. The ledger, the manner, the coded names, had her discreet inquiries already rippled through the syndicate's ranks? "Danger is a strong word, Stephen," she replied, gesturing to a wicker chair opposite her. "Please sit. Tell me what brings you here." Stephen perched on the edge of the chair, his hands clasped tightly. "I was part of them," he said, his words halting. "The syndicate. I ran messages, carried packages. Small things, you understand, but enough to see what they are. They know you've been to the manor. They know you have something you shouldn't." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the spine of her book where the ledger page hid. "And how would you know this, Stephen? A man who claims to have left such a group doesn't often risk returning to warn a stranger." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. But he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Because I want out. For good. I've seen what they do ruin lives, twist towns like this one into their game. I can't live with it any more. But they don't let people leave, Miss Marple. Not unless you have something they want or you're dead." The air grew heavier, the garden's tranquility pierced by his words. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was a steel trap, weighing his sincerity against the possibility of a ruse. "You've come to me with a warning," she said, "but warnings alone don't help. If you're truly defecting, you must offer more than fear." Stephen reached into his coat, producing a folded piece of parchment, its edges frayed. "This," he said, sliding it across the table, "a map. It leads to a safe house outside the village, near the old mill. There's evidence there, letters, names, proof of what they're doing. But you need to move fast. They're already watching you." She unfolded the map, her eyes scanning the crude lines drawn in ink. It marked a path through the woods, past the mill, to a spot labeled with a single word, sanctuary. Her fingers traced the route, memorizing it. And why should I trust you, Stefan? A map from a stranger could lead to a trap as easily as salvation. He leaned back, his face pale but resolute. You shouldn't trust me. Not yet. But check. The map. Ask about me in the village. I've been seen at the pub, the market. People know my face even if they don't know my story. If I'm lying, you'll find out before you step foot near that safe house. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Very well. I'll consider your warning and your map. But tell me, Stefan, what do you gain from this? A man risking his life for a stranger must want something. His eyes flickered with something raw guilt, perhaps, or desperation. A chance, he said simply, a chance to sleep at night, without looking over my shoulder. If you bring them down, I might have that. She studied him a moment longer, then folded the map and tucked it into her sleeve. Thank you, Stefan. I suggest you avoid lingering in St. Mary Mead. If what you say is true, it's no place for you now. He stood, tipping his hat. Be careful, Miss Marple. They don't play games. With that, he slipped out of the garden, vanishing into the lengthening shadows. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the map spread across her table. The ledger page lay beside it, its numbers a silent challenge. Stefan's warning echoed in her mind, but she wasn't one to act on impulse. Trust, she knew, was earned through diligence, not bestowed on a stranger's word. She began her inquiries subtly, as was her way. At the village post office, she chatted with Mrs. Clement, the postmistress, about recent visitors. Oh, that. Man with the gray eyes, Mrs. Clement said, sorting letters. He's been about for a month or so, quiet, keeps to himself. Bought a loaf at the bakery last week, paid in cash. Foreign, I reckon, but polite enough. At the pub, old Mr. Higgs, nursing his pint, recalled a man matching Stefan's description. Sat in the corner, he did, listening more than talking. Asked about the mill once, odd thing to care about. Said he was passing through, looking for work. Piece by piece, Miss Marple built a picture of Stefan a drifter, perhaps, but one who'd left footprints in the village's memory. No one spoke of him with suspicion, only mild curiosity. It wasn't proof of his honesty, but it was enough to warrant caution over dismissal. The map, however, was her true puzzle. She studied it under lamplight, noting the mill's location, a derelict structure by the river, abandoned since the war. The path marked on the map wound through dense woods, a place rarely trod by villagers. Sanctuary could be a haven or a snare, and she wouldn't know until she saw it herself. By morning, her decision was made. She packed a small bag, her knitting, a notebook, a flashlight, and a sturdy umbrella, its steel tip a subtle reassurance. Dressed in her usual tweed, she set out, telling her neighbor she was off for a bracing walk. The village bustled, with its usual rhythm, unaware of the secrets she chased. The woods were quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant rush of the river. Miss Marple followed the map's path, her steps careful but unhurried. The mill loomed ahead, its weathered stones moss-covered, its wheel long stilled. Beyond it, the path narrowed, leading to a clearing where a small cottage stood, its windows boarded, its door weathered but intact. The word sanctuary seemed almost mocking in the daylight. She circled the cottage, her senses alert. No footprints marred the earth, no smoke rose from the chimney. Yet as she approached the door, a faint scratch caught her ear, a sound, too, deliberate to be the wind. She froze, her umbrella gripped tightly. "Is anyone there?" She called, her voice steady. Silence answered, but the air felt charged, as if the cottage held its breath. She tested the door, finding it unlocked. Inside, the air was musty, the room sparse. A table, a chair, a single shelf. On the table lay a stack of envelopes, their edges yellowed but their seals unbroken. Her heart quickened. Evidence, perhaps, as Stephen had promised, but as she reached for the envelopes, a shadow moved in the corner. She spun, her umbrella raised, to face a figure cloaked in black, their face obscured by a scarf. "You shouldn't be here, old woman," the figure rasped, their voice low and menacing. Miss Marple's pulse raced, but her voice remained calm. "And yet here I am. If you mean to frighten me, you'll need to try harder than lurking in shadows." The figure stepped closer, a knife glinting in their hand. "You've been poking where you don't belong. The syndicate doesn't take kindly to meddlers." She met their gaze, her eyes sharp despite the dim light. Then perhaps the syndicate should choose its enemies more carefully. A knife is a poor argument against reason. For a moment they stood frozen, the tension taut as a wire. Then a distant shout broke the silence. Voices, footsteps, approaching fast. The figure cursed, bolting for a back door Miss Marple hadn't noticed. She didn't pursue. Instead, she grabbed the envelopes, tucking them into her bag. As the voices grew closer, she slipped out the front, blending into the trees as 3 men in dark coats arrived, their faces grim. They searched the cottage, their curses echoing as they found it empty. Miss Marple waited, her breath steady, until they retreated. Only then did she make her way back to the village, her bag heavier with secrets. Back at her cottage she spread the envelopes on her table. They contained letters, written in a careful hand, detailing shipments, payments, and names, some familiar, some foreign. One letter mentioned a port, another a date for a final exchange. Stephen's warning had been true, but so had his danger. The syndicate was closing in, and she would need to move quickly. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already mapping the next step. The safe house had been a risk, but it had yielded truth. Now the porter waited, and with it the heart of the syndicate's schemes. She smiled faintly, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. Danger or not, she was ready. Chapter 7. The safe house trap. The moon hung low, a pale crescent casting jagged shadows across the rolling hills beyond St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a dark woolen shawl, moved with a quiet determination that belied her age. Her steps were soft but purposeful, her eyes sharp as they scanned the horizon for the telltale silhouette of the safe house. The stranger's map, now creased from her careful handling, lay folded in her pocket, its cryptic lines and symbols memorized. She had left her cottage under the pretense of a late-night walk, a habit her neighbors found eccentric but harmless. Tonight, however, her mission was anything but ordinary. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. The path she followed was little more than a deer trail, winding through gnarled oaks and past a crumbling stone wall that marked the edge of the village's influence. The safe house, according to the stranger, a wiry man with haunted eyes who had slipped her the map 2 nights prior, was tucked in a forgotten corner of the countryside, a derelict barn repurposed for secrets. His warning still echoed in her mind. "They'll kill to keep it hidden, Miss Marple. Trust no one, and don't linger. She had tested his story through her network of village gossips, piecing together whispers of strange deliveries and unfamiliar faces. The man's tale held up, but his urgency had left a knot in her stomach. As she crested a low hill, the barn came into view, a sagging structure of weathered wood, half swallowed by ivy. Its windows were boarded, but a faint glow seeped through, the cracks betraying life within. Miss Marple crouched behind a gorse bush, her heart steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. She adjusted her spectacles, peering at the scene. The barn's isolation was deliberate, far from prying eyes, yet close enough to the main road for quick escapes. A perfect hideout for a syndicate that thrived in shadows. She checked her watch. 11:47 p.m. The stranger had said the safe house would be unguarded at midnight, a brief window when the syndicate's men rotated shifts. Miss Marple had her doubts. No operation this meticulous would leave its secrets exposed, even for a moment. She patted the small satchel at her side, containing a notebook, a pen, and a pocket knife she hoped she wouldn't need. Her plan was simple: slip in, find the documents the stranger had promised, and slip out. But simplicity, she knew, was often a trap. The wind shifted, carrying a low hum of car engine, distant but approaching. Miss Marple pressed herself lower, her knees sinking into the damp earth. Headlights flickered through the trees, then cut off abruptly. A black sedan rolled to a stop 100 yards from the barn, its engine silenced. Two figures emerged, their silhouettes tall and angular against the moonlight. One carried a flashlight, its beam sweeping the ground erratically, while the other moved with a predator's grace, a rifle slung across his shoulder. Miss Marple's lips tightened. The stranger hadn't mentioned guards. She waited, counting breaths, as the men circled the barn. Their voices were muffled, but she caught fragments. Check. The perimeter? No mistakes tonight? The flashlight bearer disappeared around the back, while the rifleman lingered near the door, lighting a cigarette. The brief flare illuminated a lean face, scarred along the jaw. Miss Marple memorized it, filing the detail away like a card in her mental index. The barn door creaked open, and a third figure emerged, a woman, her voice sharp and commanding. "Hurry up, Stokes, the shipment's due at dawn." The rifleman, Stokes, flicked his cigarette into the dirt and nodded, slinking off to join his partner. The woman vanished back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. This was her chance, but the timing felt wrong, too convenient. Like bait dangling before a hook, she crept forward, keeping to the shadows of the hedgerow. The barn loomed larger now, its weathered planks exuding a faint smell of mildew and oil. She paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning for tripwires or sensors. The syndicate was clever, and clever people didn't rely on human guards alone. Her eyes caught a glint near the door. A thin wire, nearly invisible, stretched taut across the threshold. She followed its path to a small box tucked beneath a pile of leaves, its blinking red light betraying a mechanism far more sophisticated than the barn's rustic exterior suggested. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the wire gently. She had seen such devices before, during a case involving a poaching ring in St. Mary Mead. This was no crude alarm. It was a trigger, likely tied to something explosive or mechanical. She pulled her pocket knife from her satchel, its blade worn, but sharp. and carefully snipped the wire close to the ground, holding her breath as the red light flickered and died. No explosion, no alarm. She exhaled softly, but her relief was short-lived. The barn door creaked again, and footsteps approached. She dove behind a stack of rotting hay bales, her shawl catching on a splinter. The woman from earlier stepped out, her silhouette framed by the dim light inside. She was tall, with a severe bun and a coat that rustled like expensive silk. "Stokes," she barked, "where's the bloody signal?" The rifleman reappeared, his face taut. It was fine 10. "Minutes ago, Miss Vane. Must have tripped itself?" Miss Marple's mind raced. Miss Vane. The name wasn't on the list she'd decoded, but it carried weight like a title earned through fear. Vane scanned the clearing, her eyes narrowing. "Check it, now." Stokes muttered something and knelt by the box, cursing as he saw the cut wire. Miss Marple pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart pounding, but her thoughts clear. She had seconds before they swept the area. The hay bales offered little cover, but a rusted tractor nearby provided a better option. She crawled toward it, her movements slow to avoid rustling the grass. Stokes was distracted, fiddling with the box, while Vane paced, her heels clicking against the dirt. Miss Marple reached the tractor, slipping beneath its undercarriage just as Stokes stood, his flashlight sweeping the clearing. The beam passed inches from her hiding spot, and she held her breath, willing herself invisible. Probably a fox. Stokes grunted, kicking the box. "Wires are old." Vane's voice was ice. "Fix it, and double the patrol. If someone's out here, I want them found." She stormed back inside, slamming the door. Stokes lingered, muttering, then lit another cigarette and wandered toward the sedan. Miss Marple waited, counting to 60 before easing out from under the tractor. The barn door was closed now, but a small window on the side, partially unboarded, offered a way in. She approached, her fingers testing the window's edge. The wood was soft, rotting, and gave way with a gentle push. The gap was narrow, but Miss Marple was slight, her frame honed by years of disciplined living. She squeezed through, landing softly on a dirt floor littered with straw. The barn's interior was a stark contrast to its exterior. Metal cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces gleaming under a single hanging bulb. A table in the center held maps, photographs, and a ledger, its pages marked with cryptic symbols. Miss Marple moved quickly, her eyes scanning for the documents the stranger had described, proof of the syndicate's smuggling operation through the port. She opened a cabinet, finding stacks of files labeled with dates and codes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through them, recognizing names from the list she decoded. Harrow, Grayson, Klein. But these were financial records, not the operational plans she needed. She moved to the table, her gaze falling on a map pinned beneath a glass paperweight. It showed the coastline, with red lines tracing routes from the port to a cluster of offshore coordinates. A faint click broke her focus. She froze, her ears straining. The sound came from the far wall, a panel sliding open, revealing a hidden compartment. Miss Marple's instincts screamed trap, but she had no time to react. A mechanism whirred, and the floor beneath her shifted, a trapdoor yawning open. She stumbled, grabbing the table's edge, but her satchel slipped, tumbling into the darkness below. The trapdoor snapped shut, leaving her clinging to the table, her breath ragged. She steadied herself, her mind racing. The trap was mechanical, likely triggered by her weight on a pressure plate. She scanned the floor, spotting a faint seam where the trapdoor had opened. It was locked now, but the mechanism was nearby, a small panel beneath the table, its gears exposed. She knelt, her fingers probing the panel until she found a lever. With a soft click, the trapdoor disengaged, revealing a ladder descending into a dimly lit cellar. Miss Marple hesitated. Her satchel was down there, along with her notebook and knife, but the cellar could be another trap or worse, a dead end. She glanced at the map on the table, memorizing its details, then tore off a corner showing the port routes. Tucking it into her pocket, she descended the ladder, her movements careful but swift. The cellar was damp, its walls lined with crates stamped with the same symbols she'd seen in the files. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows. Her satchel lay in a corner, its strap caught on a crate. She retrieved it, checking its contents, then turned her attention to the crates. Using her knife, she pried one open, revealing bundles of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart leapt. These were the plans, detailing shipments of contraband through the port, complete with dates, contacts, and payoffs to local officials. As she stuffed a bundle into her satchel, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She spun, knife in hand, but it was too late. A figure loomed in the cellar's entrance, a man, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a scarf. "You're a long way from home, old lady," he growled, stepping forward. Miss Marple's mind raced, but her voice was calm. "And you're a long way from manners, young man." He chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Hand over the papers, and you might walk out of here." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the ladder behind him. It was her only exit, but he blocked it, his hand resting on a pistol at his hip. She tightened her grip on the knife, calculating. "I don't suppose you'd settle for a cup of tea instead?" she said, her tone light but her gaze steely. He lunged, faster than she expected, but Miss Marple was ready. She sidestepped, using his momentum to shove him into a crate. The wood splintered and he stumbled, cursing. She darted for the ladder, her heart pounding as she climbed. His hand grazed her ankle, but she kicked free, scrambling into the barn. The trapdoor slammed shut behind her, and she wedged a chair under its handle, buying time. The barn door was still closed, but she heard footsteps outside. Stokes and his partner returning from their patrol. She grabbed the map's torn corner from her pocket, tucking it into her shawl, and slipped back through the window. The night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop, running toward the hedgerow as shouts erupted behind her. "She's here!" Stokes yelled, his flashlight sweeping the clearing. Miss Marple dove into the gorse, ignoring the thorns tearing at her shawl. She crawled, her breath shallow, until she reached a ditch by the road. The sedan's headlights flared to Covert life, and she heard Vane's voice, sharp and furious. "Find her. She's got the plans." She waited, hidden, as the men searched the clearing. Her satchel was heavy with the documents, her mind racing with their implications. The syndicate's reach was vast, but she had their secrets now, proof that could bring them down. As the sedan roared away, its headlights fading into the distance, Miss Marple rose, brushing dirt from her knees. She pulled her shawl tighter and began the long walk back to St. Mary Mead, the torn map and stolen documents burning a hole in her SATCHEL By dawn, she was in her cottage, the documents spread across her kitchen table. The syndicate's plans were clear. A shipment was leaving the port in 3 days, bound for a buyer in Amsterdam. Names, dates, and payoffs filled the pages, a web of corruption that stretched from her quiet village to the heart of London. She sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing as she traced the map's red lines. The safe house had been a trap, but she had turned it into a triumph. The syndicate thought they could outsmart her, but they didn't know Miss Jane Marple. She folded the documents carefully, tucking them into a hidden compartment in her knitting basket. Tomorrow she would take the train to the port, posing as a tourist to confirm the shipment's details. For now she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, the thrill of outwitting her pursuers warming her more than the tea. The game was far from over, but Miss Marple was playing to win. Chapter 8. The Portside Conspiracy. Salt-laden air of the port town of Brinehaven stung Miss Jane Marple's nostrils as she stepped off the rattling omnibus, her modest hat tilted against the coastal wind. The sun hung low, painting the horizon in streaks of amber and crimson, while gulls screeched overhead, their cries mingling with the clatter of dock workers unloading crates. Brinehaven was a far cry from the orderly charm of St. Mary Mead, with its narrow, cobbled streets crowded with sailors, merchants, and the occasional shifty-eyed stranger. To the untrained eye, it was a bustling hub of trade. To Miss Marple, it was a stage for secrets, and she had come to uncover one. Disguised as a tourist, she carried a woven basket and a guidebook, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath a floral scarf. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the docks from behind her spectacles. She had followed the trail from the safe house documents papers that revealed a smuggling operation tied to the syndicate's cryptic symbols. Somewhere among these weathered piers, crates marked with those same symbols held the key to the syndicate's next move. Her goal was simple, yet perilous. Find the crates, gather evidence, and slip away before anyone noticed a spinster poking about where she didn't belong. The docks stretched before her, a maze of wooden planks and towering stacks of cargo. Rough voices echoed as men hauled ropes and shouted orders. Miss Marple adjusted her scarf and strolled toward the water's edge, her pace leisurely but deliberate. She paused near a pile of barrels, pretending to consult her guidebook while her eyes darted to a nearby stack of crates. There, faintly visible in the fading light, was the symbol from the safe house, a coiled serpent encircling a crescent moon, etched into the wood. Her heart quickened, but she kept her expression bland, the picture of a curious visitor. She moved closer, weaving through the crowd, when a burly dock worker bumped into her, nearly knocking her basket to the ground. "Watch where you're going, ma'am," he grunted, his voice thick with a local accent. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, suspicion flickering, before he turned back to his work. "Terribly sorry, dear," Miss Marple said sweetly, her smile disarming. "I'm afraid I'm a bit lost. Could you point me toward the market square?" The dock worker hesitated, then jerked a thumb toward a street lined with fish stalls. "That way. Stay clear of the docks at night. Ain't safe for tourists." "Thank you ever so much," she replied, her tone warm, but her mind cataloguing his face-ruddy cheeks, a scar above his left eyebrow, and a nervous twitch in his jaw. He knew something, she was certain, but pressing him now would draw attention. Instead, she nodded and shuffled toward the market, her eyes never straying far from the marked crates. The market square was a cacophony of vendors hawking smoked herring, fresh oysters, and dubious trinkets. Miss Marple purchased a small bag of candied ginger, more to blend in than out of appetite, and lingered near a stall selling nautical maps. From her vantage point she could still see the docks, where the crates remained untouched. She needed a closer look, but the dock worker's warning echoed in her mind. The docks at night were dangerous, and she had no intention of becoming a casualty of her own curiosity. As dusk deepened into twilight, the crowd thinned and the docks grew quieter. Miss Marple slipped into a narrow alley beside a tavern where the smell of ale and fried fish hung heavy. From here she could observe the crates without being seen. She settled onto a crate of her own, half hidden by a stack of fishing nets, and waited. Patience, she knew, was her greatest ally. Hours passed, the stars emerging in a velvet sky. Her knees ached, and the chill seeped through her coat, but she remained still, her senses alert. At last movement caught her eye. 2 men approached. The marked crates, their silhouettes sharp against the glow of a nearby lantern. One was tall and lean, with a coat that billowed like a sail. The other was stocky, his cap pulled low. They spoke in hushed tones, their words swallowed by the lapping waves, but Miss Marple caught fragments: shipment, midnight, buyer. She strained to hear more, her fingers tightening around the handle of her basket. The men began inspecting the crates, prying one open with a crowbar. Inside, nestled among straw, were gleaming metal canisters, their surfaces etched with the same serpent and moon symbol. Miss Marple's breath caught. This was no ordinary cargo, those canisters suggested something far more sinister than smuggled goods. Chemicals, perhaps, or worse. Before she could ponder further, a third figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her face obscured by a hooded cloak. She moved with purpose, her voice low but commanding. "Is it secure?" she asked, her accent clipped, possibly foreign. The tall man nodded. "Sealed tight. The buyer's ship docks at midnight. We'll move it then." The woman's hood shifted, revealing a glimpse of sharp cheekbones and dark eyes. "No mistakes. The council won't tolerate another failure." Miss Marple's mind raced. The council, likely the Shadow Council she'd overheard in St. Mary Mead. This woman was no mere courier. She was someone of authority within. The Syndicate. Miss Marple needed evidence, something tangible, to connect these crates to the larger operation. A photograph would be ideal, but her small camera, tucked in her basket, required light and proximity, both of which were risky. She waited until the trio moved away, their footsteps fading toward the tavern. Creeping forward, she approached the open crate, her heart pounding. The canisters gleamed under the faint moonlight, their surfaces cold to the touch. She snapped a quick photograph, the camera's click painfully loud in the silence. She froze, listening for any sign she'd been heard. Nothing but the creak of ships and the distant hum of the tavern emboldened. She examined the crate's exterior, noting a series of numbers scratched beneath the symbol coordinates, perhaps, or a code. She jotted them down in her guidebook, her hand steady despite the adrenaline. As she stepped back, a shadow loomed behind her. She spun around, coming face to face with the scarred dock worker from earlier. "What are you doing here, old lady?" he growled, His hand gripping a wrench dot, Miss Marple's mind raced, but her face remained serene. "Oh, goodness, you startled me," she exclaimed, clutching her chest. "I was just admiring the ships. So majestic at night, don't you think?" His eyes narrowed, unconvinced. "Told you to stay away. This ain't no place for tourists." "I'm so dreadfully sorry," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sell the act. "I must have wandered off. Could you be a dear and point me back to the market?" He hesitated, his grip on the wrench loosening. "Get going, now." Of course," she said, backing away slowly. She turned and shuffled toward the market, her heart racing but her steps measured. She could feel his eyes on her until she rounded a corner, slipping into the safety of the crowd. Back in the market square, Miss Marple found a bench and sat, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked the guidebook into her basket. The photograph and the numbers were her prizes, hard-earned and invaluable. But the encounter had rattled her. The dock worker wasn't just a laborer, he was a guard, likely syndicate muscle. And that woman, with her commanding presence, was a new piece of the puzzle. Needing more information, Miss Marple decided to take a risk. The tavern where the trio had gone was her best lead. She adjusted her scarf, smoothed her coat, and entered. The rusty anchor, a dimly lit den of smoke and laughter. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and spilled ale, and the patrons, sailors, dock workers, and a few shifty types paid her little mind. She ordered a cup of tea, ignoring the bartender's raised eyebrow, and settled into a corner. Booth, her ears attuned to the room dot, it wasn't long before she spotted the stocky man from the docks, nursing a pint at the bar. He was alone, his cap still low, his fingers tapping nervously. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind working. He was uneasy, perhaps a weak link. She needed to get him talking, but confronting him directly was out of the question. Instead, she caught the eye of a young waitress, a girl with tired eyes and a quick smile. "Excuse me, dear," Miss Marple said, beckoning her over. "That gentleman at the bar looks awfully familiar. Is he a regular?" The waitress glanced at the man, then leaned in. "That's Tommy Wren. Works the docks. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's been jumpy lately. Always looking over his shoulder." "Poor dear," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "Must be hard work, the docks. Does he ever mention his troubles?" The waitress shrugged. "Not much. Heard him mutter about a big job once, but he clammed up when I asked. Why you so curious, ma'am?" "Oh, just an old woman's fancy," Miss Marple said with a chuckle. "He reminds me of my nephew, that's all." The waitress nodded and moved on, leaving Miss Marple with the name Tommy Wren and a lead. She watched him for a while, noting his glances toward the door. He was waiting for someone, likely the woman or the tall man. When he stepped outside for a smoke, Miss Marple saw her chance. She left a coin for the tea and slipped out a side door, circling around to where Tommy stood in the alley, puffing on a cigarette. The alley was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp. She approached quietly, her basket swinging lightly. "Pardon me, young man," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I seem to have dropped my handkerchief near the docks earlier. You work there, don't you?" "Might? You have seen it?" Tommy turned, startled, his cigarette nearly falling. "What? No, I ain't seen nothing. Who are you?" "Just a silly old woman," she said, smiling. "But you look like someone with a good heart." The docks must be so exciting, big shipments coming in. Important work. Do you ever get to see what's inside those crates? His eyes narrowed, but her guileless expression disarmed him. You shouldn't be a skin about that, ma'am. Dangerous business? Oh, I'm sure it is, she said, her tone conspiratorial. But I heard there's a big shipment tonight. Something special, maybe? My nephew loves stories about the docks. Tommy hesitated, glancing around. Look, I don't know nothing about no special shipment. Just do my job, all right? You should go. Of course, dear, she said, patting his arm. Thank you for humoring an old lady. She turned to leave, but not before catching the flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew about the midnight shipment, she was certain of it, and his fear suggested he wasn't fully loyal to the syndicate. A crack in their armor, perhaps. Miss Marple returned to the market, her mind buzzing. The photograph, the numbers, Tommy Wren's nervousness, it all pointed to a major operation unfolding tonight. She needed to see that shipment, but the docks would be crawling with syndicate guards by midnight. She needed a plan. She wandered toward a small cafe, its windows glowing warmly. Inside, she ordered a scone and tea, using the quiet to think. The coordinates in her guidebook might point to the ship's destination, but she had no way to decode them now. The photograph was her strongest evidence, but it wouldn't be enough without context. She needed to know what those canisters contained, and who the buyer was. As she nibbled her scone, a commotion outside drew her attention. A group of dock workers was arguing near the cafe, their voices raised. One of them was Tommy Wren, gesturing wildly at a man in a dark coat, the tall man from the docks. Miss Marple leaned closer to the window, her ears straining. You're pushing me too far, Silas, Tommy snapped. I didn't sign up for this. Keep your voice down, Silas hissed, glancing around. You want out? You know what happens to quitters. Tommy paled, stepping back. I just want my cut. I ain't risking my neck for nothing. Silas grabbed his arm, pulling him close. You'll get your cut when the ship sails. Midnight. Don't mess this up. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Midnight as expected. And Tommy was wavering perfect. She finished her tea, left a tip, and slipped out the back of the cafe. She needed to be at the docks by midnight, but she also needed an ally. Tommy Wren was her best bet. She found him later, sitting alone on a bench by the water, his cigarette long gone. The docks were quiet now, the workers having dispersed. She approached cautiously, her basket swinging lightly. Mr. Wren, isn't it? She said, her voice gentle. I couldn't help overhearing earlier. You seemed troubled. He jumped, his eyes wide. Who are you? How do you know my name? A friend at the tavern mentioned you, she said, sitting beside him. I'm Jane. Just a visitor, but I've a knack for noticing when someone's carrying a burden. You don't seem happy with your work. He stared at her, his jaw tight. You don't know what you're talking about, lady. Leave me alone. I think I do, she said softly. You're caught up in something big, something dangerous, but you don't want to be, do you? I can help if you'll let me. Tommy's eyes darted to the water, then back to her. You're crazy. You don't know who you're messing with. Perhaps, she said, her tone calm, but I know a man with a conscience when I see one. You're afraid, and not just for yourself. Tell me about the shipment, Tommy. I can make sure no one knows you helped. He laughed, a bitter sound. You? What can you do against them? "More than you think," she said, her eyes steady. "I've dealt with people like them before. They thrive on fear, but they're not invincible. Help me, and I'll help you." Tommy rubbed his face, his hands shaking. "You don't get it. They'll kill me. That shipment, it's not just goods. It's dangerous stuff. I don't even know what it is, but it's bad. They're moving it tonight to some foreign ship. I just load the crates, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Where's the ship docking? And who's the buyer?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Pier 7, midnight. I don't know the buyer's name, just that he's comin' from overseas. Silas said it's a big deal, worth millions." "Thank you, Tommy," she said, her voice warm. "You've done the right thing. Now go home. Stay out of sight tonight." He stared at her, half expecting a trick. "Why are you doing this?" "Because someone has to," she said simply. "And I'm rather good at it." Tommy shook his head, muttering, but stood and walked away, casting one last glance over his shoulder. Miss Marple watched him go, then checked her watch. 11 o'clock. 1 hour to midnight dot, she made her way to Pier 7, keeping to the shadows. The dock was deserted now, save for a few guards patrolling the perimeter. The crates were still there, stacked high, the serpent and moon symbol glinting faintly. A ship loomed in the distance, its lights cutting through the fog. The buyer's ship, no doubt. Miss Marple crouched behind a stack of barrels, her camera ready. She needed more than one photograph, something definitive. As the clock struck midnight, the woman in the cloak reappeared, flanked by Silas and a new figure, a man in a tailored suit with a foreign accent. The buyer. They inspected the crates, the woman gesturing sharply. "Load them now," she ordered. "No delays." Miss Marple snapped several photographs, her hands steady despite the risk. The guards were closer now, their footsteps heavy. On the planks. She ducked lower, her heart pounding, as one passed within feet of her hiding spot. She held her breath, waiting until he moved on. The crates were being loaded onto a small boat, destined for the larger ship offshore. Miss Marple needed one last piece of evidence, something to tie the woman to the syndicate. She crept closer, her eyes on the woman's cloak. A glint of metal caught her eye, a brooch, shaped like the serpent and moon symbol. "Perfect dot," she snapped. A final photograph, but the flash betrayed her. The woman's head whipped around, her eyes locking onto Miss Marple's hiding spot. "Who's there?" she barked, her hand reaching for something beneath her cloak, a weapon. Perhaps Miss Marple didn't wait to find out. She slipped back into the shadows, her basket clutched tightly, and darted toward the market. The guards gave chase, their shouts echoing, but she knew these streets now. She wove through alleys, her steps quick but silent, until she reached the safety of the cafe, now closed for the night. Panting, she leaned against the wall, checking her basket. The camera was safe, the photographs intact. She smiled faintly, her heart still racing. The syndicate's operation was exposed, and she had the evidence to prove it. But the woman's face lingered in her mind, those sharp cheekbones, that commanding voice. She was no ordinary operative. Miss Marple would need to be careful. As she slipped back to her lodgings, the photographs tucked safely in her basket, she felt a surge of triumph. The portside conspiracy was unraveling, and she was one step closer to bringing the syndicate to its knees. But the night's work wasn't over yet. She had a train to catch back to St. Mary Mead, and a plan to devise before the syndicate realized just how much she knew. Chapter 9. The traitor revealed. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the quaint cottages and bathing the cobblestone paths in a warm glow. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a delicate porcelain teacup cradled in her hands, her eyes fixed on the roses but her mind far from their petals. The photograph of the syndicate's crates, tucked safely in her knitting bag, weighed heavily on her thoughts. The docks had revealed a thread in the tapestry of deceit, and now, back in her village, she sensed the pattern tightening. The syndicate's influence was not just a distant menace. It was woven into the very fabric of St. Mary Mead. She sipped her tea, her sharp eyes flickering toward the street where villagers passed, their chatter a familiar hum. But something was amiss. The rhythm of the village, usually as predictable as a metronome, felt off. A glance here, a hushed word there, small signs. But to Miss Marple, they were as loud as church bells. The syndicate's reach extended to her doorstep, and she suspected one of her own neighbors was entangled in its web. Her thoughts drifted to Mrs. Harrow, the shopkeeper whose general store was the heart of village gossip. Mrs. Harrow, with her quick smile and endless anecdotes, had always seemed a pillar of St. Mary Mead. Yet, in recent weeks, Miss Marple had noticed peculiarities, a nervous edge to her laughter, a tendency to linger near the post office, and an unusual number of late-night deliveries to her shop. Could she be the syndicate's eyes in the village? The thought was unsettling, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that betrayal often wore a friendly face. Setting her teacup down, she resolved to act. She needed proof, and she needed it discreetly. The photograph from the docks was a start, but to unravel the syndicate's local ties, she had to confront the possibility of a traitor. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and made her way to the village square, her steps purposeful but unhurried, as if she were merely out for a stroll. The general store was bustling, as it often was in the late afternoon. Mrs. Harrow stood behind the counter, her auburn hair neatly pinned, her apron crisp despite the day's work. She was chatting with Mrs. Bantry, who was inspecting a tin of biscuits with exaggerated scrutiny. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Harrow called, her voice bright but her eyes darting briefly to the door. "What a pleasure. Need some wool for your knitting?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as soft as the clouds overhead. "Perhaps, Mrs. Harrow, though I was hoping you might have some of that lovely Darjeeling tea in stock. My supplies run low." Of course. Mrs. Harrow bustled to the shelves, her movements a touch too quick. "I've got just the thing. Fresh shipment came in last night." "Last night?" Miss Marple's tone was light, almost absent-minded. "My, you've been getting such frequent deliveries. Business must be thriving." Mrs. Harrow's hand faltered as she reached for the tea. "Oh, you know how it is. Folks always need something: sugar, soap, a bit of gossip." She laughed, but it was brittle, like glass about to crack. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the counter where a ledger lay open. "Indeed, the village does love its stories. I heard the oddest one the other day, something about crates at the port marked with strange symbols. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Mrs. Harrow's face paled, though she recovered quickly, busying herself with the tea tin. "Crates? Symbols? Goodness, Miss Marple, you do hear." The strangest things. Just village nonsense, I'm sure. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but her gaze unwavering, though I find nonsense often hides a kernel of truth. Mrs. Bantry, sensing a shift in the air, excused herself with a vague comment about needing to check on her roses. The shop fell quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Miss Marple stepped closer to the counter, her small frame somehow commanding the space. "Mrs. Harrow," she said softly, "I've always admired your knack for keeping the village's secrets. But some secrets are heavier than others, aren't they?" Mrs. Harrow's hands froze, the tea tin clattering softly against the counter. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Oh, I think you do." Miss Marple's tone was kind, almost maternal, but there was steel beneath it. "I've seen the late-night deliveries, the coded letters slipped into your post-box, the way you watch the street when you think no one's looking. You're caught in something bigger than you, aren't you?" Mrs. Harrow's eyes widened, her breath catching. For a moment she looked ready to bolt, but Miss Marple's steady gaze held her in place. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her voice trembled. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone in this, Clara, but you must decide, will you protect those who use you, or will you help stop them?" The use of her first name was deliberate, a reminder of the village's intimacy, of the trust that had once bound them. Mrs. Harrow's shoulders sagged, and she sank onto a stool behind the counter, her hands covering her face. "They threatened my brother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's in debt, you see. They said they'd ruin and take his shop, his home. I had no choice." Miss Marple's heart softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "Who are they, Clara? Tell me everything." Mrs. Harrow hesitated, her eyes darting to the shop's windows. "They call themselves the council. I don't know all the names, just one. Victor Klein. He's their lawyer, their fixer. He comes to the shop sometimes, late at night. I pass him messages, names of people who ask too many questions. I didn't want to, Miss Marple, I swear." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Victor Klein, a name from the stolen list, a shadowy figure she'd suspected but hadn't yet pinned down. "When does he come next?" she asked. "Tonight," Mrs. Harrow said, her voice barely audible. "After closing, he's expecting a report." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you, Clara. You've done the right thing." She left the shop with a small bag of tea, her mind already spinning a plan. Mrs. Harrow's confession was a crack in the syndicate's armor, but Klein was a dangerous man. Confronting him directly would be reckless. She needed to outwit him, to turn his own game against him. That evening, Miss Marple met with Inspector Davies at his modest office in the village constabulary. The inspector, a sturdy man with a penchant for straightforward solutions, listened intently as she recounted her findings. His bushy eyebrows rose when she mentioned Mrs. Harrow's confession. "You're saying Clara Harrow's been feeding information to this syndicate?" he asked, incredulous. "She's been running that shop since I was a lad." "People do desperate things when they're cornered," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "But she's given us an opportunity. Klein is coming tonight. We can catch him in the act." Davies rubbed his chin. "Risky. If he's as slippery as you say, he'll have an exit strategy. Which is why we won't arrest him tonight," Miss Marple said, her eyes glinting. "We'll let him think he's safe. I have an idea trap to make him reveal more than he intends." She outlined her plan, and Davies, though initially skeptical, nodded in grudging admiration. "You're a cunning one, Miss Marple. All right, let's do it your way." As night fell, St. Mary Mead settled into its usual quiet. The shop's windows glowed faintly, Mrs. Harrow moving about inside, her nervousness palpable, even from a distance. Miss Marple, hidden in the shadows of a nearby alley, watched with. Inspector Davies crouched beside her. They had rigged a small recording device, a modern contraption borrowed from Raymond West, hidden beneath the shop's counter, its microphone disguised as a stray button dot at precisely 10 o'clock. A sleek, black car rolled into the village, its engine a low purr. Victor Klein stepped out, his tailored suit stark against the rustic backdrop. He was tall, with sharp features, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He entered the shop, the bell above the door jingling softly dot. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her eyes fixed on the scene. Inside, Mrs. Harrow played her part, her voice trembling but steady as she handed Klein a folded note. "The usual report," she said. "Nothing new, except, well, Miss Marple's been asking questions." Klein's smile tightened. "Marple, the old spinster? What's she poking her nose into?" "She mentioned crates at the port," Mrs. Harrow said, her words carefully rehearsed. "Said she saw symbols on them. I told her it was nonsense, but she's sharp." Klein's expression darkened. "She's a nuisance. The council doesn't tolerate loose ends. Keep her busy, feed her false leads. We're moving the shipment tomorrow night. No mistakes." Miss Marple's fingers tightened. Around her knitting bag, the recording device was capturing every word, but she needed more: a name, a location, something to tie Klein to the syndicate's core. She'd instructed Mrs. Harrow to push, subtly, to draw him out. Mrs. Harrow hesitated, then said, "Hi, heard a rumor something about a deal in London. Is that true? I just want to know what I'm risking my neck for." Klein's eyes narrowed, but his ego got the better of him. "London's the big prize," he said, his voice low. "Lady Ashford's hosting a gala tomorrow. The deals set their millions in play. You just keep the village quiet, and you'll get your cut." Miss Marple's pulse raced. Lady Ashford, a name from the ledger, a financier with ties to the syndicate. This was the thread she'd been chasing. She glanced at Davies, who gave a subtle nod. The recording was gold, but Klein was too cautious to linger. He pocketed the note and left, his car vanishing into the night. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple played the recording for Davies, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the table. "He's clever," she said, "but he's arrogant. That's his weakness. We have enough to move on him, but we need to be careful." "The gala in London is our next step," Davies grunted. "You're planning to go to London?" "This is getting bigger than St. Mary Mead, Jane." "It always was," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "The syndicate's roots may be here, but its branches stretch far. We'll cut them down, one by one." As Davies left to coordinate with his superiors, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the recording device silent on the table. Mrs. Harrow's betrayal had been a wound, but her confession was a weapon. Klein's words echoed in her mind: London, Lady Ashford, a gala. The game was escalating, and Miss Marple was ready to play her next move. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically. The village slept. unaware of the battle, being fought in its shadows. But Miss Marple was wide awake, her mind a whirl of plans and possibilities. The traitor had been revealed, and the syndicate's secrets were unraveling. Tomorrow she would set her trap for Klein's handler, but tonight she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The recording was her triumph, a step closer to dismantling the shadow council that dared to taint her village. Chapter 10. The Handler's Gambit. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, painting the cobblestone lanes in hues of gold and amber. Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest parlor, the faint ticking of her mantel clock punctuating the silence. On the table before her lay a small, unobtrusive gramophone record, its surface gleaming faintly under the lamplight. The recording it held was no ordinary music. It was a confession. A sliver of truth wrested from the jaws of a cunning adversary. Victor Klein, the suave lawyer and suspected syndicate handler, had unknowingly bared his soul in a trap of Miss Marple's design. Now, with the recording secured, she felt the weight of her next move pressing down like a storm cloud on the horizon. She adjusted her spectacles. Her fingers nimble despite the years, and sipped her tea, the delicate porcelain, cup warm against her palms. The trap had been a gamble, a staged meeting in the old barn at the edge of the village, orchestrated with the precision of a chess master. She had posed as a nervous informant, feeding Klein just enough bait to draw him out. Inspector Davies, her reluctant but loyal ally, had hidden in the loft, ready to pounce. Yet Klein, slippery as an eel, had sensed the noose tightening and fled before the cuffs could snap shut. The recording, however, was her prize, a snippet of his voice admitting ties to the syndicate's operations, laced with names and places that pointed to a larger web, and London. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she replayed the moment in her mind. Klein's polished demeanor had cracked just enough to reveal the predator beneath his clipped words. The faint sneer when he thought he held the upper hand. "You think you've outsmarted us, don't you?" he had said, his voice low and venomous. "This game is bigger than your little village." She had smiled then, her usual mild expression masking the steel within. Now, as she sat in her quiet parlor, she knew the game was far from over. The recording was a key, but it needed a lock, and that lock, she suspected, lay in London. The clock chimed 6, pulling her from her thoughts. She set the cup down and reached for her notebook, its pages filled with her neat, looping handwriting. The names Klein had mentioned: Ashford Grayson, a shadowy figure called the Broker, were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to unravel. London, with its sprawling streets and glittering facades, was the syndicate's heart. To strike there she would need more than cunning. She would need audacity. A knock at the door startled her. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened it to find her nephew, Raymond West, standing on the threshold, his face flushed from the evening chill. His tweed coat was slightly askew, and his eyes sparkled with the restless energy of youth. "Jane," he exclaimed, stepping inside, "I got your message. What's this about a trip to London? You're not seriously chasing after those criminals, are you?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Raymond, dear, do come in and stop fussing. I'm merely planning a little outing. London has such lovely galleries this time of year." Raymond snorted, tossing his hat onto the rack. "Galleries, my foot. You've got that look in your eye, the one that says you're up to something. Spill it, Aunt Jane. What's happened?" She gestured to the sofa, and as he sat, she recounted the events of the barn meeting, keeping her tone light, as if discussing a particularly interesting bridge game. Raymond's expression shifted from amusement to alarm as she described Klein's escape and the recording's contents. "You've got a recording of a syndicate handler?" he said, leaning forward. "Aunt Jane, this is madness. You can't just waltz into London and take on a criminal network. They're dangerous." "Most things worth doing are a little dangerous," she replied calmly, pouring him a cup of tea. "Besides, I have no intention of waltzing anywhere. I shall be discreet as always." Raymond shook his head, but a grudging smile tugged at his lips. "You're impossible. What's the plan, then? You can't go alone." Miss Marple considered this. Raymond, for all his impulsiveness, was sharp and resourceful. His presence could be useful, especially in navigating the city's complexities. "Very well," she said. "You may accompany me, but only if you promise to follow my lead. This is no place for heroics." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Agreed. When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning," she said, her tone brisk. "The early train. Pack lightly, Raymond. We'll need to move quickly." The train to London rattled through the countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Miss Marple's thoughts. She sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, while Raymond fidgeted across from her, leafing through a newspaper without reading it. The recording, safely tucked into her handbag, felt like a live coal, dangerous, but potent. Klein's words had mentioned a meeting in London, a final arrangement at a place called the Gilded Rose, a high society club in Mayfair. The name Ashford had surfaced again, tied to a gala that very evening. It was a lead too promising to ignore. "Raymond," she said, not looking up from her knitting, "do you know anything about the Gilded Rose?" "And then?" He glanced up, surprised. "Fancy place. Exclusive. Members only. Politicians, tycoons, the odd aristocrat. Why?" She smiled faintly. "Just curious. It sounds like the sort of place one might overhear interesting things." Raymond's eyes narrowed. "You're planning to crash it, aren't you?" "Crash is such a crude word," she said, her needles pausing. "I prefer to think of it as an unexpected visit." He groaned but didn't argue. By the time the train pulled into Paddington Station, Miss Marple had already mapped out her approach. The Gilded Rose was a fortress of wealth and influence, but every fortress had its cracks. She would find one. Mayfair buzzed with the quiet elegance of old money. The Gilded Rose stood at the end of a discreet street, its facade a blend of Georgian grandeur and modern opulence. Chandeliers glittered through tall windows, and liveried doormen stood guard like sentinels. Miss Marple, dressed in a modest but tasteful gray dress, her silver hair neatly pinned, looked every inch the respectable dowager. Raymond, in a borrowed dinner jacket, hovered at her side, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Aunt Jane," he whispered as they approached, "how exactly are we getting in? We're not on the guest list." "Leave that to me," she murmured, adjusting her shawl. At the entrance, she approached the doorman with a disarming smile. "Good evening, young man. I'm Mrs. Agatha Winthrop, here for Lady Ashford's gala. My nephew, Mr. West, is my escort. I'm afraid my invitation may have been misplaced in the post." The doorman, a burly man with a skeptical eye, hesitated. Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Lady Ashford was most insistent we attend. She mentioned a rather delicate matter she wished to discuss. I'd hate to disappoint her. The mention of Lady Ashford, combined with Miss Marple's air of quiet authority, worked its magic. The doorman's expression soft, and he waved them through. "Enjoy the evening, ma'am." Raymond exhaled as they stepped into the opulent foyer. "How do you do that?" he muttered. "People rarely question confidence," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. The gala was in full swing, men in tails, women in shimmering gowns, the air thick with perfume and cigar smoke. A string quartet played in the corner, and waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a tall woman in a sapphire gown, her auburn hair piled high. Lady Ashford, she presumed, based on Klein's description in the recording. "Raymond," she said softly, "mingle, listen, but don't draw attention." He nodded and drifted into the crowd, his writer's curiosity making him a natural observer. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved with the grace of someone who belonged, her eyes sharp behind her mild smile. She paused near a group of men discussing stocks, catching fragments of conversation about shipments and discreet channels. The syndicate's shadow was here, woven into the glittering tapestry of wealth. She edged closer to Lady Ashford, who was holding court near a marble fireplace. The woman's laugh was bright, but her eyes were calculating, darting to every face in the room. Miss Marple picked up a glass of lemonade from a passing tray and positioned herself near a potted palm, close enough to overhear without being noticed. "Everything is in place for tomorrow," Lady Ashford said to a man in a pinstriped suit, her voice low. "The broker expects delivery by midnight. No delays." The man nodded, his expression tense. "And the old woman? Klein says she's sniffing around." Miss Marple's heart skipped, but her face remained serene. Lady Ashford's lips curled. "Klein's paranoid. She's a nobody, a meddling spinster. If she gets too close, we'll deal with her." The words were a cold splash of reality. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her mind racing. The broker, the delivery, the dismissive mention of her, it all pointed to a deal of immense scale, one that could cement the syndicate's power. She needed more, something concrete. Her eyes fell on a small door behind the fireplace, partially hidden by a velvet curtain. A servant emerged, carrying a tray, and slipped back inside. A private room, perhaps. She glanced at Raymond, who was chatting with a young heiress across the room. Catching his eye, she gave a subtle nod toward the door. He excused himself and joined her, his brow furrowed. "What now?" He whispered. "That door," she said. "I need to see what's behind it. Keep watch." Raymond looked like he wanted to protest, but nodded. Miss Marple slipped behind the curtain, her movements swift and silent. The door was unlocked, leading to a narrow hallway lined with oak paneling. At the end was another door, slightly ajar, light spilling through. She crept forward, her heart steady despite the risk. Inside was a small study, its walls lined with bookshelves. A desk held a scattering of papers, and a telephone sat in one corner, its receiver off the hook. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the papers, letters, invoices, a map marked with red ink. One word caught her eye: docks. The port again, the same one she'd investigated in Chapter 8. The syndicate was moving something big, and soon. A noise behind her made her freeze. She slipped behind a heavy curtain just as the door opened. Victor Klein's voice cut through the silence, sharp and agitated. "She's here, Ashford. I saw her in the crowd." "That old bat is trouble." Lady Ashford's reply was cool. Then, handle it, Victor, quietly." Miss Marple's breath caught. She clutched her handbag, where the stolen key from the manor and the ledger page rested. The curtain was her only shield, and it felt paper-thin. Klein's footsteps approached, then paused. "If she's poking around, she's closer than we thought. The broker won't be pleased." "Then make sure she doesn't leave this building," Ashford snapped. "The deal is tomorrow. We can't afford loose ends." The door clicked shut, and Miss Marple exhaled. She waited, counting to 10 before slipping out. The papers on. The desks were too risky to take, but she memorized the map's details, coordinates, a time, a name. The Nightingale. A ship, no doubt. She crept back to the hallway, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken, rejoining Raymond in the ballroom. She kept her expression neutral. "We're leaving," she whispered. Now, he didn't argue, sensing the urgency in her voice. They slipped out through a side entrance, the cool night air a relief after the stifling gala. In the taxi back to their hotel, Miss Marple recounted what she'd overheard, her voice steady, but her eyes alight. "The Nightingale," Raymond repeated, frowning. "A ship?" "Likely," she said, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm. "And tomorrow night something will happen at the docks. We need to be there." Raymond stared at her. "Aunt Jane, you're going to get us killed." She smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Not if we're clever, dear." "And I do believe we are." The next morning, Miss Marple sat in their modest hotel room, the recording playing softly on a borrowed gramophone. Klein's voice filled the air, each word a nail in the syndicate's coffin. "The broker's got the docks locked down. He'd said in the barn. Ashford's handling the money. Grayson's got the muscle. It's all set for the 30th. Tomorrow, Miss Marple thought. The pieces were falling into place. She turned to Raymond, who was poring over a map of London's docks. "We need a plan," she said. "Something to disrupt their deal without exposing ourselves." Raymond looked up, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You're really doing this, aren't you? Fine. What if we tip off the police anonymously? Let them raid the docks?" She shook her head. "Too risky. Klein and Ashford have informants. We need to be there to ensure the evidence isn't swept away." He groaned but didn't argue. Together they devised a plan simple but bold. Miss Marple would pose as a dock worker's mother, delivering a forgotten lunch. Raymond would scout the perimeter, ready to signal Inspector Davies, who had agreed to wait nearby with a small team. The goal was to catch the syndicate in the act, with evidence too damning to ignore. The docks were a labyrinth of crates and shadows, the air thick with salt and oil. Miss Marple, in a plain coat and scarf, carried a tin lunchbox, her steps slow, but purposeful. The Nightingale loomed ahead, a sleek freighter with lights flickering on its deck. She spotted Klein's silhouette near a stack of crates, his voice low as he spoke to a man in a dark coat. The broker, perhaps? She approached, her heart steady. "Excuse me, young man," she called, her voice quavering just enough to sell the role. "I'm looking for my son, Tommy. He forgot his lunch." Klein turned, his eyes narrowing. For a moment she thought he'd recognized her, but her disguise held. "No Tommy here," he snapped. "Get lost." "Oh, dear," she said, fumbling with the lunchbox. As she did, she slipped a small listening device, borrowed from Davy's, under a crate. It was a risk, but it could capture the deal's details. She shuffled away, her heart racing as Klein's gaze lingered. Raymond met her at the edge of the docks, his face pale. "They're loading something," he whispered. "Crates, unmarked. I saw Ashford's car nearby." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing to the next step. The listening device would record, but they needed visual proof. She handed Raymond a small camera. "Get as close as you can." One photo, then signaled Davies. He hesitated, then nodded. As he slipped into the shadows, Miss Marple retreated to a safe distance, her eyes fixed on the nightingale. The night was alive with danger, but also possibility. The syndicate's empire was teetering, and she would be the one to push it over. The plan unfolded with the precision of a well-played hand. Raymond's photo captured Klein and the broker exchanging a briefcase, the crates in the background. The listening device recorded Ashford's voice, confirming the deal's scale millions in smuggled goods, bound for foreign shores. When Davy's team swept in, the syndicate's leaders scattered, but the evidence was secure. Back at the hotel, Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea, the weight of the night settling over her. The recording, the photo, the map, they were enough to cripple the syndicate, but not destroy it. The broker had escaped, and Ashford's influence lingered. London was only a battle, not the war. Raymond slumped in a chair, exhausted but exhilarated. "We did it, Aunt Jane. We actually did it." She smiled, her needles clicking softly. "A step, dear. Only a step. But a good one." As the city hummed outside, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the gala, the docks, the next move. The syndicate's heart was in London, and she was closer than ever to piercing it. The game, as Klein had called it, was indeed bigger than her village. But Jane Marple was no ordinary player.